Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, just like always, I've got some longer stories lined up for you. Something you can just let play in the background while you relax, maybe do something else, or just slowly drift off. Before we get into it, I just want to say, however you're listening right now, whether you're gaming, scrolling, or trying to fall asleep, I appreciate you being here. And yeah, these ones are a bit heavier. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in that quiet, lingering kind of way. So settle in, let's start with the first story. So this happened about a year ago, and even now I still catch myself thinking about it at completely random times. Not because it was some huge dramatic event, but because of how slowly everything unfolded. At first, it didn't even feel like something was wrong. It just felt slightly off. I had been working remotely for about 2 years at that point. Same routine every day. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk, log in, answer messages, go through tasks. Nothing exciting, but it was stable, predictable, and honestly, I liked that. Around that time, our company hired someone new for our team. His name was Daniel. He joined as another remote employee, same time zone as me, which was already rare. Most of our team was scattered across completely different schedules, so having someone online at the same time actually felt kind of nice. At first, everything about him seemed completely normal. Friendly, polite, maybe a little quiet, but not in a weird way. Just the kind of person who doesn't talk much unless there's something to say. We had a few casual conversations during onboarding, just basic stuff, where we're from, how long we've been working remotely, that kind of thing. Nothing stood out. But then after maybe a week or two, I started noticing something small, every time I logged in the morning. He was already online, which okay, not that weird, but what was weird was that he was always marked as active. Not idle, not away, active like he had just moved his mouse. At first I didn't think much of it, maybe he just started early. Some people do that, but then one day I woke up earlier than usual. Like way earlier, I'm talking around 5:30 in the morning. Couldn't sleep, figured I might as well get a head start on work, so I logged in. Expecting no one to be there, and there he was, active, same as always, no messages, no activity in chat, no commits, no updates, just active. I remember staring at his name for a second longer than I probably should have, then I just shrugged it off. Maybe he wakes up insanely early. Some people are like that. I didn't think about it again, at least not consciously. But over the next few days, I started noticing a pattern. No matter what time I logged in, he was already there. And not just online, active, consistently, even on weekends. That's when it started feeling strange, not alarming, just strange. Like one of those tiny details your brain keeps flagging even when you're trying to ignore it. So one Saturday morning, out of pure curiosity, I opened the work app. Didn't even plan to work, just wanted to check something. And yeah, he was there, active, again. That's when I actually messaged him for the first time outside of work stuff. Just something casual. Hey, random question, do you just keep your computer on all the time? He replied almost instantly. Yeah, pretty much lol, I hate logging back into everything. That answer made sense, too much sense, like it closed the question immediately, and for a moment I felt kind of stupid for even thinking about it, so I dropped it, went on with my day, didn't think about it again, until a few days later when something else happened. Something that didn't have an easy explanation. It started with something small, again, that's kind of the theme with all of this, honestly, nothing big, nothing obvious, just little things that didn't quite line up. So a few days after that conversation, I was working on a task that required pulling some older files from our shared system. Nothing complicated, just digging through folders, checking timestamps, comparing versions, routine stuff. At some point, I noticed a file that had been modified. Recently, like within the last hour, which was weird because that file hadn't been touched in months. I opened it, expecting to see some kind of update or correction, but nothing had changed, at least not visibly. No new content, no edits, no comments, just the timestamp. Updated. I figured maybe someone opened it and accidentally triggered a save. Happens all the time, so I checked who last modified it. And yeah, it was Daniel. That alone wasn't strange, but the timing was. Because at that exact moment, he hadn't said a single word all morning. No messages, no activity in our channels, just active, same as always, so I messaged him. Hey, did you update the archive file just now? Again, instant reply. No, I haven't touched that. I stared at the message for a second. Then I looked back at the file. Same timestamp, same name, same record. I even refreshed it. Still showed him as the last person who modified it, so I sent a screenshot. Shows you here, there was a pause this time, not long, but long enough to feel different. Then he replied, oh weird, must be some sync bug or something. And yeah, that made sense too. We did have occasional issues with the system syncing incorrectly. Files would sometimes show wrong timestamps or duplicate edits. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. So again, I let it go. But this time, something stuck, because now it wasn't just the always active thing, it was activity. Without explanation, and once you notice something like that, it's hard to unnotice it. After that, I started paying a little more attention. Not obsessively, just noticing little things, like how he would sometimes respond instantly to messages even when they weren't directed at him. Like he was already reading them the moment they were sent, or how he'd occasionally reference conversations that happened while he was supposedly offline. Nothing major, just subtle, but consistent. Then one evening something happened that I couldn't brush off as easily. It was late, around 11:30 p.m. I wasn't working, just had the app open in the background while watching something. At some point, I got a notification, a direct message from Daniel, which was already unusual because we didn't really DM each other much, so I opened it, and it just said, "You left that file open again." I frowned because I hadn't been working. I hadn't opened any files. So I replied, "What do you mean?" There was no response. I waited a minute, then 2, then 5, nothing, which was the first time that had ever happened. Usually he replied instantly, so I checked his status, still active. Of course, I opened the file system just to be sure, checked my recent activity. Nothing, no open files, no edits, no sessions, so I messaged him again. Which file? Still nothing. At that point, I felt that small, quiet kind of unease, not fear, just that feeling that something isn't adding up, so I decided to just close everything and go to sleep. Didn't think too much about it. At least I tried not to. The next morning I checked the chat again. The message was still there, but now there was a reply. Sent at 2:14 a.m. Never mind, wrong person. That was it, no explanation, no follow-up, just wrong person. And yeah, okay, mistakes happen. People send messages to the wrong chat all the time, but something about it felt off. Because we weren't in any shared private threads where that kind of mix-up would make sense. And more importantly, he never made mistakes like that before. He was precise, consistent, almost too consistent. That's when I started wondering if maybe I was missing something bigger, not something dramatic, just something I didn't understand yet. And once that thought settled in, it didn't really leave. Over the next week, I told myself I was going to stop thinking about it. That was the plan. Just do my work, keep my head down, and stop turning normal things into weird things. Because that's what it felt like, right? Like I was taking a guy being a little odd and building some whole mystery around it. And I'm not usually like that. I'm not paranoid. I don't jump to conclusions. If anything, I tend to over-explain things away, so I really did try. But then the meeting happened. We had our regular Monday team call. Same people as always. Cameras mostly off, everyone half awake, manager going over deadlines and priorities. Nothing unusual. At one point, our lead asked if anyone had looked at a client folder over the weekend, because a couple of documents had been opened late Saturday night and the system had flagged it as unusual activity. No one said anything for a second. Then Daniel spoke up. Very casually, he said, "I was in there for a bit. Just checking something." Our lead asked what he was checking. Daniel paused and then said, "I thought I saw a duplicate contract." That answer should have been fine, except one of the account managers immediately said, "There isn't a duplicate contract in that folder." And then there was this awkward little silence. The kind where nobody wants to make it weird, but everybody notices something didn't land right. Daniel just went, "Oh, then I must have been in the wrong folder." And our manager moved on. That should have been the end of it. A tiny awkward moment, nothing more. But later that day I was talking to one of the account managers, Jenna, and she brought it up without me even mentioning it. She said, "Does Daniel kind of creep you out?" Not in a joking way. In a genuine, low-key way. I asked what she meant. And she said she couldn't really explain it, but he kept referencing files and conversations he technically shouldn't have been involved in yet. Not confidential stuff, just things outside his lane. For example, the week before, he had messaged her asking if a client had calmed down yet about a pricing issue. The problem was that discussion had only happened in a small channel he wasn't part of. She thought maybe someone had mentioned it to him privately, but no one had. Then she laughed it off and said maybe he was just nosy. But she didn't really sound convinced, and honestly, neither was I. That conversation stayed with me the rest of the day. Because until then, all of this had lived in my head as a collection of small, weird moments. Things I couldn't really explain, but also couldn't prove meant anything. Now somebody else had noticed it too. Not the exact same things, but the same feeling. That quiet sense that Daniel always seemed to know a little more than he was supposed to. So I started paying closer attention. Again, not in some dramatic investigative way. I just kept my eyes open, and once I did, I noticed more. A lot more. He had this habit of joining calls early. Like really early, 10 minutes, 15 sometimes, and if someone else joined before the meeting officially started, he'd already be there. Silent, waiting, not talking, not making small talk, just present. One afternoon, I joined a call room about 12 minutes early because I needed to check my audio. Daniel was already in there, no surprise, he didn't say hi. Didn't react at all, actually. I thought maybe he was muted and not paying attention, so I just started adjusting my settings. Then without any lead-in, he said, "You should probably be careful what you leave open when you screen share." I froze. Not because of what he said exactly, but because of the way he said it. Calm, matter of fact, almost helpful. I asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "Last Thursday, when you were showing the sprint board, you had another tab open behind it for a second." I tried to remember. I vaguely recalled switching tabs during that meeting, but I hadn't shared anything sensitive. At least I didn't think I had. So I asked what tab he meant, and he just said, "Probably nothing important." Then he went quiet again. That was it. The whole exchange lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it stayed with me all day. Because I went back and checked the recording of that meeting. There was no visible extra tab, nothing behind the board, nothing flashed on screen, nothing that should have caught anyone's attention. And yet he had said it with total confidence, like he'd seen more than everyone else did. That night I was still thinking about it when I got a message from Jenna, just one line. "Okay, this is getting weird." I asked what happened. She said Daniel had messaged her asking if she had decided what to do about a document she had downloaded to review privately. Not shared, downloaded. Locally, she hadn't told anyone she downloaded it. And before you ask, no, it wasn't malware or anything like that. We're talking about internal work systems, normal security, all logged. There wasn't supposed to be any way for another coworker to casually know what someone had opened on their own machine unless they explicitly shared it or mentioned it. So I asked her if maybe she'd said something in chat and forgot. She said no, then she sent me a screenshot of his message. It read, "If you're going to send back comments on that draft, do it before noon tomorrow. They're already impatient." No greeting, no explanation, just that. And the thing was, he was right. They were impatient. She was working on comments for that draft. He shouldn't have known that. At this point, I stopped feeling merely curious. I started feeling watched, not in some cinematic way, just in that subtle digital way that's somehow worse because it feels both impossible and plausible at the same time. Like there's probably a boring explanation, but until you find it, your brain keeps filling in the worst one. I remember sitting there at my desk that night, staring at our work app, seeing his little green active dot next to his name, and feeling this weird tension in my chest. Because suddenly that green dot didn't feel harmless anymore. It felt like presence, like observation. And for the first time, I seriously considered that maybe Daniel wasn't just weird. Maybe he was doing something. I just had no idea what. A little pause before we keep going. This is one of those stories where the first half makes you feel like maybe people are overreacting, and then every new detail makes the whole thing feel 10% worse. Anyway, let's keep going. The next morning, I decided I needed to test something. Not confront him, not report anything, just test it. Because at that point, I still didn't have anything solid. Just patterns, feelings, screenshots of oddly specific messages, and I knew how that sounds. So I came up with something simple. I created a document in our shared workspace with a bland, forgettable title. Something boring enough that nobody would click on it unless they were specifically looking around where they shouldn't be. Inside, I wrote a single line, "Need to move the Lawson draft before Friday. Don't mention this in team chat yet." That was it. No real context. No actual task attached to it. Just bait. I didn't share it, didn't link it, didn't reference it anywhere. Document just sat there in a folder that technically several people had access to, but nobody had any reason to open. Then I waited. For most of the morning, nothing happened. I almost felt embarrassed for doing it, like I was turning office weirdness into a private detective game. Then around 1:20 p.m., Daniel messaged me. "Is Lawson getting moved off the current timeline?" I actually felt my stomach drop. Not because the message was dramatic, but because it was so clean. So casual, like he was asking a completely normal follow-up to information he should never have seen. I stared at it for a full minute before answering. Then I just wrote, "What makes you ask?" He replied almost immediately. "Thought I heard someone mention Friday." Heard someone. That wording made my skin crawl a little, because nobody had mentioned Friday. Not in a call, not in a chat, nowhere. Just that hidden line in the document. I didn't respond. I just took a screenshot and sent it to Jenna. She replied with, "Okay, no, absolutely not." And that was the moment it crossed from vague discomfort into something else. Because now I had something deliberate, something testable. Something that suggested he either had access to things he shouldn't or was snooping around in a way that went way beyond normal curiosity. Jenna told me I needed to report it. I said I wanted one more day. One more chance to make sure I wasn't missing an obvious explanation. She told me I was being too cautious. She was probably right, but I wanted to understand what exactly was happening before I took it to management. That afternoon, I checked a few settings in the systems we used. Shared file permissions, version logs, user access history. Nothing advanced, just whatever I could see as a normal employee. And what I found was not much. Daniel had opened the bait document. That part showed up clearly. Timestamped at 1:16 p.m., 4 minutes before he messaged me. So there it was, proof that he had opened something he had no reason to open. But technically he did have folder access. So on paper it wasn't a security breach, just suspicious behavior. Nosy, unprofessional, hard to explain but not exactly reportable on its own. Still, it confirmed enough for me to stop doubting myself. The problem was that it also raised a worse question. If he was comfortable opening random documents in shared folders just to see what was in them, how far had that gone? And what exactly had he been looking at? By that evening, I had gone from mildly unsettled to genuinely distracted. I wasn't getting work done. I kept replaying all the weird moments in my head and slotting them into a new pattern. The wrong person message, the comments about things he shouldn't know, the always active status, the instant replies, the early calls, the way he phrased things like he was observing, not participating. Once you started arranging it all together, it stopped looking random. It started looking intentional. That night, I closed my laptop earlier than usual and told myself I was done thinking about it until the morning. Then at 12:07 a.m. my phone buzzed. Another message from Daniel. Just one sentence. "You really should delete things like that after you get your answer." I sat up in bed so fast I nearly dropped my phone. There was no greeting, no emoji, no context, just that. I opened the work app and of course he was active. Of course he was. My hands were actually shaking a little at that point, which I hate admitting because it makes it sound more dramatic than it felt in the moment. The truth is, it wasn't panic. It was that cold rush you get when someone confirms they know exactly what you've been doing. I didn't answer, didn't sleep much either, and by morning I had already decided I was done trying to decode this on my own. I sent Jenna the screenshot. Then I booked 15 minutes with our manager, because whatever this was, snooping, monitoring, some weird fixation on everyone's work, I didn't want to be the only person carrying it anymore. And honestly, part of me was hoping there would be some boring explanation, some simple, embarrassing technical reason that would make me feel ridiculous for making it into a whole thing. I would have loved that. I didn't get it. My meeting with our manager was at 9:30 the next morning. I barely slept, so by the time it started I was running on coffee and nerves, which is never a great combination when you're trying to explain something that already sounds borderline ridiculous. Her name was Melissa. She was one of those managers who was usually calm no matter what, which I appreciated, but it also meant I couldn't really tell what she was thinking while I talked. I told her I didn't want to make a formal complaint yet. That was the first thing I said, because I knew how it sounded. I knew that my coworker always seems to know things he shouldn't wasn't exactly a clean HR sentence, so I just laid it out as plainly as I could. I mentioned the repeated odd messages, the comments about files and conversations outside his scope, the bait document, the midnight message telling me I should delete it after I got my answer. Then I sent her the screenshots. For the first 30 seconds after she read them, she didn't say anything. She just looked at the screen. Then she asked me a question I wasn't expecting. Have other people mentioned him to you? I said yes. Jenna, specifically. Melissa nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. Then she said, "You're not the first person to bring up concerns. You're just the first person who brought me something concrete." That sentence hit me harder than I expected, because part of me had still been clinging to the idea that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just an accumulation of weird but harmless stuff. Apparently not. Melissa told me that over the previous month or so, a few people had made small comments about Daniel that never quite amounted to anything actionable. That he joined things too early, that he inserted himself into work he wasn't assigned, that he asked strangely specific follow-up questions, that he sometimes knew the direction of projects before official updates went out. Nobody had phrased it as a major issue, more like quiet discomfort. Enough to notice, not enough to escalate. Until now, she asked me to forward everything I had and said she'd speak to it before talking to Daniel directly. That part made sense immediately, because if this was some kind of technical issue or some permissions mess or something worse, confronting him first would just give him time to cover it up. So that's what happened. I sent over the screenshots, Jenna sent hers, and then I waited, which honestly was the worst part. I kept working, kept answering messages, kept pretending my heart rate didn't spike every time I saw Daniel's name pop up anywhere. He didn't message me that morning. He didn't message me that afternoon either, but he was online, active, all day. At around 3 p.m, Melissa messaged me privately and asked if I could jump on a quick call with her and someone from it. That was the moment I knew this had moved beyond, coworker is kind of weird. I joined and there was a guy from internal security named Eric on the call. He introduced himself, thanked me for flagging it, and then asked a few really specific questions. Did Daniel ever reference local files or only shared ones? Did his comments happen more often after meetings, during them, or at random? Did I know whether he used multiple accounts, multiple devices, or any external plugins for the apps we used? I answered as best I could, mostly shared files. Sometimes during meetings, sometimes right after. No idea on the devices. Then Eric told me something that made the whole situation shift shape in my head. He said they had already found unusual access behavior tied to Daniel's account. Not a breach exactly, not some movie-style hack, but a pattern of opening large numbers of internal documents unrelated to his tasks. Folders, planning notes, draft files, archived client materials, random reference docs. Basically anything he could technically reach, he was poking through. Not editing, just opening, reading. Sometimes for only a few seconds, sometimes late at night, sometimes on weekends, and because his role had been set up with broader read permissions than it probably should have had during onboarding, the system never blocked him. That's why he knew things. He wasn't magically seeing private data. He was just spending an absurd amount of time crawling through anything he could access. I felt this weird mix of relief and disgust. Relief because at least there was an explanation. Disgust because the explanation was that he had been actively rummaging through people's work like a digital raccoon for who knows how long. Eric said they were still reviewing the scope of it, but the bait document and the midnight message were especially useful because they showed awareness and intent. That mattered. It meant this wasn't casual curiosity anymore. He knew he was being tested. He knew he shouldn't have opened it, and instead of backing off, he messaged me about it. That was the part that pushed it from odd behavior into a conduct issue. Melissa asked whether I felt comfortable continuing to work normally for the rest of the day. I said yes, mostly because I didn't know what else to say. What I wanted to ask was whether he knew they were looking into him, but I didn't have to. Eric answered that question before I even voiced it. No, he said. And we'd prefer to keep it that way until access is locked down. So for the rest of that day, I went through the motions while knowing a quiet investigation was happening in the background. It was surreal. At one point, Daniel replied in a team thread with some bland work update, and I remember just staring at his message thinking, you are typing like a totally normal person, while it is literally going through your access logs right now. That disconnect was weirdly unsettling. By the end of the day, nothing public had happened. No announcement, no confrontation, no dramatic removal from Slack, just silence. Then at 7:48 p.m., long after I'd logged off, Melissa sent me one sentence. We've restricted his access and will address it formally tomorrow. That was it. I read that message 3 times. Then I actually put my phone face down on the table and just sat there. Because up until that moment, some small part of me still thought this might somehow dissolve into nothing. A misunderstanding, a permissions accident, a weird but harmless habit, but access doesn't get restricted over harmless habits. Not that quickly, not with it involved. And suddenly I realized that whatever happened the next day was probably going to be bad. I just didn't know how bad yet. All right, small pause here. At this point the story stops being, is this guy weird? And turns into, how far exactly did this person push something they had no business doing? So yeah, let's keep going. The next morning, Daniel wasn't online. That alone felt strange. No green dot, no early presence, no quiet active status waiting there before everyone else logged in. Just nothing. By 9:15, people had started noticing, not in a dramatic way, just little messages. Anyone heard from Daniel? Is he off today? Thought he had the client handoff notes. Normal team chatter. Melissa didn't answer any of it directly. She just said Daniel would be unavailable that day and to reroute anything urgent through her, which in corporate language might as well have been a siren. By noon, the rumors had started. Nothing wild, just the usual office speculation. Maybe he quit, maybe there was a family emergency, maybe he got sick. I didn't say anything and neither did Jenna. We both knew enough to stay quiet. Then a little after 1 p.m, Melissa asked me to join another quick call. This time it was just her. She looked tired, not angry, not dramatic, just tired in that specific manager way where you've spent hours dealing with something deeply unnecessary. She told me she couldn't share every detail, which I expected, but she did tell me enough. Daniel had been confronted that morning with a summary of the access logs and screenshots. At first he denied that anything was wrong. He said he was just proactive, that he liked staying informed, that understanding the wider context of projects made him better at his job, which is such an infuriatingly polished excuse that I actually laughed when she said it, not because it was funny. Just because it was so obviously the kind of thing someone says when they've convinced themselves their behavior sounds professional if they phrase it carefully enough. Melissa said the conversation changed when they showed him the bait document and the message he sent afterward, because there was no professional explanation for that. He couldn't say he accidentally saw it in passing. He couldn't say it was directly relevant to his role. And he definitely couldn't explain why he messaged me after midnight telling me to delete it. Apparently once they pushed on that part, his whole tone changed. He got defensive, then irritated. Then he started arguing that everyone at the company was careless with information, that files were just sitting there, that if people didn't want things seen, they should secure them better. Which is one of those arguments that instantly tells you the person knows exactly what they were doing. It's like getting caught trying door handles in a neighborhood and then acting like the real problem is that some people forgot to lock theirs. Melissa said they asked him directly whether he had been intentionally monitoring coworkers, work outside his responsibilities. His answer, according to her, was, monitoring is a strong word, which is maybe the least reassuring response humanly possible. At that point, they ended the conversation and suspended his account access fully, pending formal review. She didn't say terminated, but she didn't really need to. The shape of it was obvious. I asked if they knew why he was doing it. She hesitated for a second, then said, he described it as staying ahead. That phrase stuck with me. Staying ahead, like work was some giant game board and he thought the smartest person in the room was the one quietly harvesting information before anyone else knew they'd need it. And honestly, that explanation fit disturbingly well. Because when I thought back on all his behavior, the early joins, the specific questions, the constant active status, the way he always seemed one step ahead of conversations, it all pointed to the same thing. He wasn't just being nosy for entertainment. He was building a private advantage out of everyone else's information, not enough to do something cinematic with it. Just enough to look sharper, more informed, more plugged in than he really was. That was the creepy part. It wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. It was methodical, calculated, and weirdly mundane. After the call, I sat there for a long time doing absolutely no work, just staring at my inbox. Because once Melissa said it out loud, all the earlier moments reorganized themselves in my head again. The weird confidence, the comments about things that hadn't been announced, the gentle little warnings dressed up as helpful observations. Even that first message, you left that file open again, suddenly felt different, not like a mistaken message, Maury like a probe, like he wanted to see how much I knew or whether I'd react. That afternoon, Jenna called me, not messaged, actually called. The first thing she said was, I knew it, not in a triumphant way. Maury like someone finally being allowed to stop doubting their own instincts. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, mostly just replaying moments that felt creepy in hindsight. Things that seemed minor before. How he'd referenced draft versions he was never assigned. How he somehow knew when people were behind on work they hadn't admitted to anyone yet. How sometimes he would phrase questions in a way that made it sound like he'd already read the answer somewhere else. The worst part was realizing how much stress that kind of person creates without anyone being able to point to a clean, obvious violation at first. Because one weird comment, whatever, one strangely timed message, fine, one guy who joins calls early, not a crime. But stack enough of those little moments together, and suddenly you feel like you've been sharing a workspace with someone who doesn't really respect boundaries in any meaningful way, and that changes the whole atmosphere. By the end of the day, the team had been told only that Daniel was no longer with the company. Fast, clean, no details, no drama, his accounts were disabled, his name disappeared from the team directory. And just like that, the constant green dot was gone. You'd think that would have made everything feel immediately better. It didn't, not right away, because even after he was gone, I caught myself noticing the absence. Logging in early and instinctively checking whether he was there. Seeing a message about a project and wondering, for half a second, who else had already read it. It's strange how long a small source of tension can keep echoing after it's removed. Over the next couple of weeks, the whole thing settled into that strange post-incident phase where life technically goes back to normal, but everyone's behavior is just slightly different. No one talked about Daniel directly, not really, at least not in any official space, but people became a lot more careful. Folders got cleaned up. Permissions got reviewed. Random draft documents stopped sitting in broad shared directories. People started namming files less casually, too, which sounds silly until you realize how much information can be revealed by a sloppy title alone. Instead of things being called stuff like client panic notes or possible budget issue, suddenly everything had sanitized names like Q3 working draft or internal review V2. It changed the vibe, not in a huge way. Just enough that you could feel it, and I think that's what bothered me most afterward, the fact that one person being weird with access had quietly changed the way the whole team behaved. Melissa later held a general meeting about information hygiene, which was clearly inspired by what happened even though she never said his name. She framed it as a process improvement thing. Need to know access, reduced folder sprawl, better permission discipline, less oversharing in documents, normal, sensible stuff. But the undertone was obvious. We all knew why we were suddenly talking about who could see what. And during that meeting, I caught myself doing something I hadn't noticed before. Every time someone said, "This is probably fine to leave in the shared folder," my brain immediately pushed back. No, it is, or at least not necessarily. That shift stuck. Even now, I'm more careful than I used to be with digital spaces in general. Work, cloud drives, shared notes, all of it. Because I think a lot of us grow up with this vague assumption that if someone can access something, but technically shouldn't need to, they'll probably just ignore it. Most people do, but not everyone. And once you run into someone who won't, you stop assuming invisible boundaries are real boundaries. A few days after Daniel was gone, Jenna forwarded me something she'd received from one of the project coordinators. It was a screenshot from an older email thread where Daniel had volunteered for a client prep task before anyone officially assigned it. At the time, it had seemed proactive, helpful even, but in context it looked different. The prep task relied on details from planning notes he'd already read ahead of time, so he wasn't anticipating needs because he was insightful. He was anticipating them because he'd been rummaging around in advance and then using the information to look impressive. Once that clicked, a bunch of other moments made sense too. The reason he often seemed unusually prepared on calls. The reason his follow-up questions sometimes sounded so sharp. The reason he could position himself like he understood project concerns before they were formally discussed. It wasn't intuition. It was preloading. He was reading everyone else's homework before class and then acting naturally talented when the discussion started. That part made me angrier than I expected. Not because he'd fooled management, exactly. He hadn't gotten far enough for that to really happen in a major way, but because he had created this subtle pressure where other people kept feeling half a step behind in interactions with him, without understanding why. He manufactured an advantage out of information that was never really his, and it made normal collaboration feel contaminated in hindsight. Then, about a week after he left, Melissa asked if I had a few minutes to talk. This wasn't formal, just a quick one-on-one. She thanked me again for bringing it up and said something that honestly stayed with me more than the rest of it. She said, "The hardest workplace issues are often the ones that make people doubt themselves first." That was exactly it, because if someone is openly hostile or stealing work or doing something obvious, people know how to respond. But when the problem is just 100 tiny things that feel off, your first instinct is usually to question your own perception. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe that's harmless. Maybe I'm being unfair, and while you're busy doing that, the pattern keeps growing. I told her that was probably why it took me so long to say anything. She said that was normal. Then she told me a couple of other people had mentioned after the fact that Daniel had made them uncomfortable too, not in a threatening way, but in a how do you know that kind of way. They just hadn't known what to do with the feeling, which I understood completely. Because what do you even report at first? My coworker seems over-aware. That sounds ridiculous until it doesn't. The weirdest part is that we never got some dramatic final reveal. No giant secret. No proof he'd been doing something criminal. No elaborate spyware situation. Just a guy who had been given slightly too much visibility, decided to exploit it constantly, and convinced himself that cleverness made it acceptable. In some ways, that's less frightening than a bigger explanation. In other ways, it's worse, because it means this kind of thing doesn't require some genius-level scheme. It just requires access, curiosity, and a weak enough sense of boundaries. A month later, someone mentioned his name in passing during a call by accident. Just a quick, "Oh, I think Daniel used to handle that," before correcting themselves. And the silence that followed was so immediate and weirdly heavy that it almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, just because everyone clearly had the same reaction at once. Right, him. Then we moved on, and that was basically it. No closure email, no official explanation, just a quiet removal and a bunch of people slowly readjusting to the fact that the atmosphere felt lighter now. That's another thing I noticed. Lighter, calls felt less tense. Shared channels felt more normal. I stopped second-guessing every oddly specific comment people made. Jenna stopped hesitating before mentioning draft work. Even the little act of opening a document without wondering who else might be poking around in it felt strangely relaxing. You don't realize how much low-level stress you've been carrying until the source disappears. But despite all that, the reason I still think about it sometimes is because of how ordinary it looked from the outside. If you'd taken any single moment in isolation, it would have sounded minor. A strange message, a weird comment, a person joining calls too early, a guy reading more documents than he needed to. None of that sounds like the kind of story you remember. And yet somehow, as a whole, it created this very specific kind of unease that I still don't really know how to describe except by saying. It felt like working near someone who didn't believe private space existed unless a locked door physically stopped him. And in a digital workplace, that mindset can spread way farther than people realize. Alright, one last section for this story. There's a little ending to it that isn't dramatic, but honestly kind of says everything. About 2 months after Daniel left, I was cleaning out an old folder in our shared workspace. Just digital housekeeping. Deleting duplicate drafts, moving outdated references, the kind of thing nobody wants to do but everyone eventually has to. And while I was doing that, I found one of the documents I'd created as bait, the Lawson one, still sitting there. Still bland, still stupid, still carrying that single line I had written to see whether he'd bite. I opened it and just stared at it for a second, because it felt weirdly small. That was the thing that finally cracked the whole situation open, not some elaborate trap, not some big technical investigation from the start. Just one boring sentence in a shared file, written by a tired employee who wanted to know if he was imagining things. There was something oddly humbling about that. How often you don't need some massive revelation. You just need one simple test that cuts through your own self-doubt. I ended up deleting the file. Then I emptied the trash folder too, which felt more symbolic than necessary. And that should have been the neat ending, I guess. But the actual reason this story has stuck with me isn't because Daniel got caught. It's because of what I learned about how easy it is to normalize discomfort when it arrives gradually. If he had done one huge, blatant thing on day one, everybody would have reacted. That's not how it happened. It was drip by drip. A comment here, a weird coincidence there, a message that made no sense, a detail he shouldn't know. Each individual moment was easy to sand down into something explainable. And when enough things are almost explainable, people tend to keep explaining. That's the dangerous part, not just with work stuff either. In general, you can spend a long time living alongside a pattern that bothers you because each piece alone doesn't seem worth the fuss. And then one day you look back and realize the cumulative effect was massive. That's what happened here. I wasn't scared of Daniel exactly. I didn't think he was going to do something dramatic. What he did was subtler than that. He made the environment feel porous, like boundaries were optional if they weren't enforced. And once someone introduces that feeling into a shared space, everyone else starts tightening up around it. I became more guarded. Jenna became more guarded. Other co-workers who probably never even knew the details still adjusted around the fallout. All because one guy treated access like permission and curiosity like justification. A while later, I mentioned the whole thing to a friend outside work, and he asked me a simple question. Do you think he knew it was creepy? And I've honestly gone back and forth on that ever since. Part of me thinks yes, obviously. You don't send someone a midnight message saying they should delete the thing they used to catch you unless you know your behavior is shady. But another part of me thinks maybe he had spent so long rationalizing it that he genuinely saw himself as smart rather than invasive. Like he thought everyone else was just less observant, less strategic, and that if he happened to use available information better than other people, that was their problem. I almost find that version worse. Because at least deliberate malice has a shape you can understand. Self-justified boundary crossing is slipperier. People like that don't think they're doing something wrong. They think they're being efficient, proactive, ahead of the curve, and they can do a lot of damage while telling themselves a flattering story about why it's fine. Anyway, that's basically the whole thing. No big dramatic confrontation, no movie ending. Just a strange coworker, 100 tiny moments of unease, one simple test, and the very uncomfortable confirmation that my instincts weren't being dramatic after all. So yeah, if there's any takeaway from this, I guess it's this. When something feels off in a repeated, specific way, don't ignore that feeling forever just because you can explain each incident individually. Patterns matter. And sometimes the thing you need to trust most is not the weirdest single moment, but the way all the little moments keep lining up. That's where this story ends, and honestly, I'm glad it does. Because for a while there, every green active dot on my screen started to feel a little sinister. And I'd rather not go back to that. All right, that was the first one. And I think what makes stories like that stick is how quiet they are. No explosions, no dramatic screaming match, just a person slowly realizing that someone around them has been crossing lines the whole time. So for the next story, we're shifting away from the workplace a little. This one starts off like a normal favor between family members, something small, something that should have been simple, and then little by little. It turns into one of those situations where you realize somebody isn't asking for help anymore. They're testing how much of your life they can take over before you finally push back. Let's get into the next one. So this started as a favor, a really small one, the kind of thing you don't even think twice about saying yes to because saying no would feel weirdly selfish. It involved my older sister, Claire. We've always had a decent relationship. Not super close, not distant either. Just that middle ground where you get along fine, you show up for birthdays, you help each other out when needed, but you're not calling each other every day. She's always been a little more intense than me. More organized, more driven, the kind of person who plans things weeks in advance and expects everything to go exactly how she imagined it. I'm not like that. I tend to go with the flow more, which looking back probably made me the perfect person for what ended up happening. Anyway, about 6 months ago, she called me out of nowhere. Not unusual, but she sounded a little stressed. She explained that she and her husband were going through a rough patch, nothing dramatic, just needing space, which is one of those phrases that can mean anything from mild tension to something much bigger. Because of that, she wanted to stay somewhere else for a while, not permanently, just temporarily, a couple of weeks. And yeah, you can probably already guess where this is going. She asked if she could stay with me. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment. One room is my bedroom, the other is technically a guest room, but really it's more of a half-office, half-storage space. Still, it was usable, so I said yes. Of course I did, because what kind of person says no to their sibling asking for a place to stay during a rough time? She sounded relieved immediately. Like noticeably, she said it would just be for a short reset. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most. She'd keep to herself, wouldn't disrupt anything, just needed a quiet place to think and figure things out. That all sounded reasonable. So we set a date. She moved in the following Saturday. At first, everything was exactly how you'd expect. She brought a couple of suitcases, some personal stuff, her laptop, a few books, nothing excessive. She was polite, grateful, kept saying things like, "I promise I won't be in your way," and just pretend I'm not even here. And honestly, for the first few days, that's pretty much how it felt. We coexisted. She worked remotely from the guest room. I did my normal routine. We'd occasionally cross paths in the kitchen, make small talk, nothing heavy. It was easy, comfortable even. I remember thinking, okay, this is going to be fine. This is just a temporary thing. A simple favor. And then around day 5, something shifted. Not in a big way, just a small comment, but it stuck. I was in the kitchen making coffee and she walked in and said, kind of casually, "Hey, do you always leave the counter like this?" I looked down. There was nothing on the counter except my coffee mug and a spoon. So I said, like what? She gestured vaguely and said, "Just not wiped down." Her tone wasn't aggressive, more observational, but there was something underneath it, like she was knotting a flaw. I shrugged and said, "Yeah, I mean, I clean it later, it's not dirty." She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly and said, "Okay," and that should have been the end of it. But later that day, when I went back into the kitchen, the counter was spotless. Like aggressively clean, everything aligned, wiped, dried, organized. Even my coffee stuff had been moved into a neat little arrangement I hadn't set up. Again, not a big deal, technically helpful, but it felt deliberate, like she had corrected something. I didn't say anything, because why would I? It's just cleaning right. But that was the first moment where I felt that tiny, almost unnoticeable shift from guests staying temporarily to something slightly different. Not bad, just different. Over the next few days, more of those small things started happening. She'd rearrange things, nothing major, just subtle adjustments. The way the dishes were stacked, the way the towels were folded, where I kept certain items in the kitchen. Always small enough that it didn't feel worth bringing up, but consistent enough that I started noticing a pattern. And the thing is, she never asked. That was the part that made it feel off. She didn't say, "Hey, would you mind if I reorganized this?" She just did it, quietly, efficiently, like she was improving the space. And again, I told myself I was overthinking it, because technically nothing she was doing was wrong. It was my place, sure, but everything she touched ended up cleaner, more organized, more intentional, so I let it go. For about a week, until the first actual conversation happened, the one that made me realize this wasn't just about cleaning. The first real conversation happened about a week in. Up until then, everything had been subtle enough to ignore. Annoying, maybe. Noticeable, definitely. But still within that grey zone where you tell yourself it's not worth turning into a thing. That changed one evening. I got home a little later than usual, around 8 p.m. Long day, didn't feel like cooking, so I grabbed takeout on the way back. Nothing fancy, just something quick. When I walked in, Claire was already in the kitchen, not cooking, just standing there, looking at the counter. Specifically the counter where I was about to put the takeout. She glanced at the bag in my hand and then back at me. And then she said in that same calm, almost neutral tone, "You've been eating out a lot this week." Not a question, a statement. I said, "Yeah, just been busy." She nodded, but it wasn't really agreement. More like she was filing that information somewhere. Then she said, "That's probably why you feel tired all the time." I paused for a second, because I hadn't said anything about being tired. Not that day, not recently. So I asked, "What do you mean?" She leaned against the counter and said, "You mentioned earlier this week that you were low energy. Diet has a big impact on that." Now, technically, she wasn't wrong. And yeah, I probably had said something like that casually at some point, but the way she brought it up felt off, like she had been keeping track, not in a caring way, more like data. I laughed it off a little and said, "I mean, it's just been a busy week." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Then she said, "You should probably cook more while I'm here. I can help you get into a better routine." That was the first time the word routine came up. And something about it immediately made me a little uncomfortable, because again, I hadn't asked for help. This wasn't a self-improvement project. She was staying at my place temporarily. That was the arrangement, so I said, still trying to keep it light, "I'm good, honestly. I just eat whatever's convenient most of the time." She didn't push back right away. She just nodded, but there was a pause, a longer one this time. Then she said, "Convenient usually just means inconsistent." That was it. That was the moment something shifted from slightly annoying to quietly intrusive. Not because of what she said exactly, but because of the pattern, observation, assessment, conclusion, and then a suggestion framed as improvement. All delivered calmly enough that calling it out would make you look like the one overreacting, so I didn't push it. I just said, "I'll keep it in mind," and went to my room with my food. But that night, I couldn't fully relax. Because now I was aware of something new. She wasn't just reorganizing my space, she was evaluating my habits, and once you notice that, it changes how you experience everything else. Over the next few days, the comments became more frequent, still subtle, still calm, but definitely more intentional. Things like, "You sleep pretty late for someone working full-time," or "You check your phone a lot in the mornings," or even, "You don't really plan your week, do you?" Each one delivered casually, almost like passing thoughts, but always just sharp enough to make you pause. And the thing is, none of them were completely wrong. That's what made it harder. If she had been saying things that were obviously inaccurate, it would have been easy to dismiss. But she was pointing out real things, just framing them in a way that made it feel like I was being quietly audited in my own home. At one point, I actually caught myself adjusting my behavior slightly. Putting my phone down faster, wiping the counter immediately instead of later, thinking twice before ordering food, and that's when it really hit me. I was changing how I lived in my own space because of a guest. That realization didn't feel good, not dramatic, just uncomfortable. Like something had slowly crossed a line without me noticing exactly when it happened. Then came the moment that made it impossible to ignore anymore. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had no plans, just wanted to relax, maybe watch something, do nothing for a few hours. Claire came into the living room holding a notebook. She sat down across from me and said, "I've been thinking about how we can make your daily structure a bit more efficient while I'm here." I blinked. Because that sentence didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a plan, so I said, "What do you mean?" She opened the notebook. And inside was a schedule, not hers. Mine. I remember just staring at the notebook for a second, because my brain didn't essere perirenyate yeri cheteroya verigeru. It was laid out neatly, time blocks, headings, morning routine, work hours, break structure, evening wind down, all written in her handwriting. Not loosely, not as a suggestion list. It looked finalized, like something already decided. I looked up at her and said, half laughing, "Is this a joke?" She smiled a little, but not in a joking way, more like she expected that reaction. Then she said, "No, I just think you benefit from a bit more structure." Again, calm, measured, reasonable tone, which somehow made it worse, because if she had come in aggressively, I could have pushed back easily. But this was framed as help. Improvement, optimization. I leaned back on the couch and said, "Claire, I didn't ask for this." She nodded immediately. "I know." And for a split second, I thought that was the end of it, like she was acknowledging the boundary. But then she added, "But you don't always need to ask for help to need it." That line just sat there, and I felt something in my chest tighten a little, because now it wasn't just about the schedule. It was about control, framed as care. I said, trying to keep my voice even, "I'm doing fine. I've been living like this for years." She flipped a page in the notebook and said, "Exactly. That was the first time her tone changed, still calm, but firmer, less suggestion, more assessment. She started pointing at parts of the schedule. You wake up inconsistently. You don't eat at regular times. You don't separate work and rest properly. Each point delivered like a fact, no room for discussion, just statements. I could feel myself getting irritated, but also weirdly unsure how to respond, because again, she wasn't yelling. She wasn't insulting me. She was just systematically pointing out things and presenting a solution, which made pushing back feel disproportionate, but something about the situation was clearly off. So I said a little more directly this time, I don't want a schedule. That should have been enough, simple, clear, but she didn't close the notebook. She just looked at me for a second and then said, you don't want to feel better. And that's the kind of question that traps you, because if you say no, you sound irrational. If you say yes, you're agreeing with her premise, so I just said, that's not the point. She tilted her head slightly like she didn't understand. Then she said, then what is the point? And I realized in that moment that we weren't having the same conversation. To her, this was a logical improvement plan. To me, it was someone trying to restructure my life without being asked. So I said more firmly now, the point is this is my space and my routine. I didn't ask you to change it. There was a pause, a real one this time, and for the first time since she arrived her expression shifted, not dramatically, just slightly. The calm surface cracked a bit. She closed the notebook slowly. Then she said, quieter, I'm just trying to help. And yeah, that's the line, right? The one that makes you second guess everything. Because now if you push back harder, you're not just rejecting control, you're rejecting help. So I softened a little. I said, I know, but I don't need this. She nodded again, but this time it felt different, less like agreement, more like she was storing the response. Then she stood up, took the notebook and said, okay, just that, no argument, no pushback, no discussion, and honestly, that almost felt worse. Because it didn't feel resolved, it felt paused, like she had decided not to push right now. That evening was quiet, too quiet, no comments, no observations, no suggestions, just normal conversation like nothing had happened, and for a moment I thought maybe that was it. Maybe she realized she overstepped. Maybe things would go back to normal, but the next morning everything changed, not with words, with actions. The next morning I woke up to my alarm like usual. Nothing felt different at first. Same routine. Same perive yerucheren or yersores tero yereni ye peroelusna. I grabbed my phone, turned the alarm off and just lay there for a minute, scrolling a little, trying to wake up. Then I noticed something. The time, 7:00 a.m. I don't wake up at 7:00, not unless I absolutely have to. I usually wake up around 8:30, sometimes 9 if I don't have early meetings. So I frowned and checked again. Still 7:00. For a second I thought maybe I had set an early alarm and forgotten, but I don't do that, ever, so I opened the alarm app, and yeah, there was a new alarm. 7:00 a.m. Labeled, start your day properly. I just stared at it because I knew immediately who had done it. There was no question. I got up, walked into the kitchen, and Claire was already there. Of course she was. Coffee made, dishes already done. Everything set, she looked at me and smiled. Good, you're up early. Not why are you up? Not surprised, expecting it. I said, did you set an alarm on my phone? She didn't even hesitate. Yeah, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I let out a small breath and said, why would you do that? She took a sip of coffee and said, because you said you don't have structure. That wasn't what I said at all, but the way she said it made it sound like it was. Like she had already rewritten the conversation in her head. I said more firmly now, that's not okay, don't touch my phone. She nodded, again immediate. I won't, and that should have been reassuring, but it was because of what happened next. She gestured toward the counter. I made breakfast, eat before you start working. I looked over. There was a plate, eggs, toast, something that looked very intentionally balanced. And suddenly I realized something. This wasn't about the schedule anymore. This was her implementing it, quietly, piece by piece, without needing my agreement. I said, Claire, you don't need to do this. She replied, I know. Same tone as before, calm, certain, and then she added, but you also won't do it yourself. That line hit differently, because now there was judgment in it, not loud, not aggressive, but very clear. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because I could feel the conversation slipping into something circular. Something where every pushback would just be reframed as proof that I needed the help. So I just grabbed coffee and went back to my room. Didn't eat the breakfast, didn't say anything else, but the whole morning felt off, like my routine had been quietly overwritten and I didn't know how to fully reset it. Over the next few days, the pattern escalated, not dramatically, still subtle, but consistent. She started knocking on my door in the mornings, not loudly, just enough. Are you up? If I didn't answer, she'd knock again a few minutes later. Then there were reminders. Have you eaten yet? Did you take a break? You've been sitting too long. Each one sounding like concern, but feeling like supervision. At one point, I left my room to grab water and noticed something on the fridge. A piece of paper, magnets holding it in place. I walked over. And yeah, it was the schedule, my schedule, the one from the notebook, printed, clean, organized, time blocks clearly labeled. Morning routine, work session. Lunch, break, evening reset, all of it displayed like it was official, like it belonged there. I just stood there for a second, looking at it, and I felt this very specific kind of frustration. Not explosive, not angry, just tight, because this wasn't a suggestion anymore, it wasn't even a conversation. It was implementation without consent in my own space. I took the paper down, folded it once, put it on the table, didn't say anything. Later that day, when I walked back into the kitchen, it was back on the fridge, unfolded, exactly where it had been. That's when it stopped feeling like overstepping, and started feeling like something else entirely. I didn't say anything the first time she put the schedule back up, not because I was okay with it, but because I was trying to figure out how to address it without turning the whole situation into something bigger than it already was. That's the trap with things like this. It's never one big moment where you can clearly say, this is unacceptable. It's a series of small pushes, and if you react too strongly to one of them, it feels disproportionate. So you wait, and while you're waiting, it keeps happening. That evening, I finally brought it up. We were both in the kitchen again. She was doing something with the dishes. I walked over, took the schedule off the fridge again, and held it up. Can you stop putting this back up? Simple, clear, no aggression. She didn't turn around immediately. She just kept rinsing a plate. Then she said, why? Not defensive, not apologetic, just questioning, like the request itself needed justification. I said, because I don't want it there. She dried her hands slowly, turned around and looked at me. Really looked this time, not casual, focused. Then she said, it's just a guide. I shook my head. I didn't ask for a guide. There was a pause. And then she said something that shifted the whole tone again. You're reacting like I'm doing something harmful. That line hit in a very specific way, because suddenly the conversation wasn't about her actions anymore. It was about my reaction. I said, it's not harmful, it's just not something I want in my space. She crossed her arms slightly, not aggressively, just closed off. Then she said, I'm staying here too. That was the moment everything clicked. Because until then I had still been thinking of this as my apartment, my routine, her visiting temporarily. But in her mind, this had already become shared territory, shared structure, shared control. I said, slower now, you're staying here temporarily. That doesn't mean you get to reorganize how I live. She didn't respond right away. She just held my gaze for a second longer than usual. Then she said very calmly, I'm not reorganizing how you live, I'm trying to improve it. And there it was again, that framing, improvement, like the problem wasn't what she was doing. The problem was that I didn't recognize the benefit. I felt my patience start to slip, not explosively, just enough that my voice got a little sharper. I don't want you to improve it. That landed. For a second, her expression tightened. Not a lot, but enough to show it got through. Then she said, okay. Same word as before, same tone, flat, contained. And again, it didn't feel like resolution. It felt like something being stored away. I put the schedule on the table again and walked away. Didn't want to keep going in circles. That night was quiet, even more than usual. No comments, no reminders, no suggestions, and honestly, part of me felt relieved, like maybe that conversation had finally drawn a line, maybe she understood, maybe things would reset. But the next day it escalated in a way I wasn't expecting, because instead of pushing directly, she changed tactics. The next day she didn't say anything. Not in the morning, not in the afternoon, no reminders, no comments, no observations. At first it felt like relief, like maybe the conversation we had finally landed. Maybe she understood the boundary, but then I started noticing something else. Not what she was saying, but what she was doing. She stopped interacting with me normally, not in an obvious, dramatic way, just subtle distance, shorter replies, less eye contact. No casual conversation. If I said something, she'd respond, but just enough to end it. No follow-up, no engagement. It felt controlled, like she had pulled something back. At first I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe she was just tired or stressed or dealing with her own stuff, which to be fair she probably was, but the pattern held, consistently. Then came the second layer. She started doing things louder, more visible, not aggressive, just intentional. Waking up early, making breakfast again, but this time not offering it, just leaving it there, where I could see it. Cleaning the kitchen in a very noticeable way. Opening and closing cabinets just a bit louder than necessary. Sitting at the table with her notebook again, the same one with the schedule, but not showing it to me. Just writing, occasionally glancing up, then back down. It created this weird atmosphere, like I was being observed again, but without direct interaction. And somehow that felt worse, because before at least everything was out in the open. Now it felt passive, like pressure without words. One afternoon I came out of my room and saw her sitting at the table. Notebook open, pen in hand. She didn't look up right away. Then after a second she said, "You skipped breakfast again." Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement. I stopped walking, looked at her, and said I didn't want it. She nodded slowly, wrote something down. Actually wrote something down, and that's when something in my brain just snapped into clarity. I wasn't being helped, I was being tracked. Not literally maybe, but functionally, observed, noted, evaluated, and the worst part, she wasn't even hiding it anymore. I said, "What are you writing?" She didn't hesitate, just observations. That word, observations, it felt clinical, detached, like I wasn't her sibling anymore. I was a subject. I let out a small breath and said, "About me." She looked up this time, held eye contact, and said, about patterns. Patterns, not behavior, not habits, patterns. Something about that wording made it feel even less human. I stood there for a second trying to decide how to respond, because now it wasn't subtle anymore. This was direct, clear, and uncomfortable, so I said, this is getting weird. She tilted her head slightly. Why? And there it was again, that same dynamic. She genuinely didn't see the issue, or at least she acted like she didn't. I said, because you're literally writing things down about what I do during the day. She responded immediately, I'm not judging you. That wasn't the point, and I think she knew that, but again she reframed it, took the emotional part out, made it sound neutral, harmless. I said, it doesn't matter, it's still not okay. There was a pause, then she closed the notebook, slowly, and said, you're taking this very personally. And yeah, of course I was, because it was personal. It was my home, my routine, my life. And somehow it had turned into something I felt monitored inside of. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't going to stop on its own. Because in her mind, nothing she was doing was wrong. And if someone doesn't think they're doing anything wrong, they don't see a reason to change. That night, I didn't sleep well. Not because of anything dramatic. Just that low-level tension that doesn't veyerokarel ucherayete esya peroelen or este yeriu. Derajeyekaro gederate yerel yejeri shayeri veteri shayenya. Every small thing from the past couple of weeks kept replaying. The comments, the schedule, the alarm, the notebook. And the part that stuck the most wasn't even te or cheterorenade yerela. It was how espero kaore kratkoi enorenarete or de yerela. Like everything had a logic behind it, a system, and I was the only one treating it like something was wrong. At some point around 2 a.m. I realized something simple. If I didn't stop this now, it was just going to keep going. Not because she wanted to take over my life in some dramatic way, but because she genuinely believed she was improving it. And that made it harder to push back against. So the next morning I made a decision, not a soft one, not a let's see how it goes one, a clear one. When I walked into the kitchen, she was there again, same as always. Notebook nearby, coffee ready, everything controlled. I didn't sit down, I didn't ease into it, I just said, this isn't working. She looked up immediately, not surprised, almost like she had been expecting it. Then she said, what do you mean? Said, I mean you can't stay here anymore. There it was, clear, direct, no room to reinterpret it. For the first time since all of this started, her expression actually changed in a noticeable way. Not dramatically, but enough. Her eyebrows pulled together slightly. She leaned back a little and said, you're serious? I nodded. Yeah, there was a pause, a real one, longer than any we'd had before. Then she said, this is because of the schedule, and that question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it showed how differently she was seeing everything. To her, this was about one thing, the schedule. To me, it was about everything. The control, the monitoring, the way my space had stopped feeling like mine. I said, it's not just that. She waited, so I continued. It's the comments, the tracking, the way you keep trying to change how I live when I didn't ask for that. She didn't interrupt, just listened, but her face had shifted again, less confused now. More defensive. Then she said, I'm trying to help you. Same line, again. And this time it didn't land the same way, because now I had already decided. I said, I know you think that. But I didn't ask for it and I don't want it. Another pause. Then she said something that honestly surprised me. You're comfortable being like this. No anger, just disbelief, like she genuinely couldn't understand choosing not to improve. I said, yes, simple, no explanation, no defense, just yes. And that seemed to frustrate her more than anything else so far because there was nothing for her to work with, no argument to refine, no flaw to point out, just refusal. He stood up slowly, closed the notebook, and said, I didn't expect you to react like this. I almost said something back, but stopped because there was no point. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was just two completely different perspectives that weren't going to align. She asked, how long do I have? I said, a couple of days, enough time to figure something out. She nodded, didn't argue, didn't push, just said, okay, and walked out of the room. That was it, no explosion. No dramatic fight, just a clean break, and honestly, that felt heavier than any argument would have, because it meant this wasn't emotional for her, it was structured, even the ending. The next couple of days were quiet, not tense in an explosive way, just empty. Clea didn't bring up the schedule again, didn't make comments, didn't write anything down in front of me, at least not where I could see it. She mostly stayed in the guest room, packing things slowly, organizing her stuff the same way she had organized everything else, neatly, deliberately, without rushing. We spoke, but only when necessary. Short conversations. Logistical, what time are you leaving tomorrow? Do you need help with anything? That kind of thing, and what struck me the most was how normal she acted. Not apologetic, not angry, just composed, like this was simply the next step in a process. On her last morning, I woke up at my usual time. No alarm, no knock, no are you up, and I remember lying there for a second, realizing how different it felt. Quiet, undisturbed, like my space had finally reset. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already dressed, her bags by the door, everything clean, of course, cleaner than I would have left it. She looked at me and said, I'll call a car in a few minutes. I nodded. Then there was a pause, not uncomfortable, just unfinished, so I said, I hope things work out for you, and I meant it, despite everything. She gave a small nod, then said something that stayed with me way longer than I expected. I think you're okay with things staying the same for too long. I didn't respond right away because I knew what she meant, and part of it was probably true, but that wasn't the point, so I just said, maybe, but they're my things to keep the same. She held my gaze for a second, then nodded again. This time a little more final, and that was it. She left, no hug, no dramatic goodbye, just the door closing, and silence, real silence. The kind that feels bigger than usual after someone's been in your space for a while. I stood there for a minute just listening. Then I looked around the apartment. Everything was still structured, clean, organized in the way she had left it, and for a second I hesitated, because technically it looked better, more put together, more intentional. But it didn't feel like mine, so over the next hour I started undoing things, not aggressively, just resetting, moving items back to where I usually kept them, letting the space go back to something a little less perfect, a little more natural. And the weird part is that felt better, not because it was better objectively, but because it was mine again. That's the thing this whole situation made me realize. There's a difference between improvement and control. And the line between them isn't always obvious from the outside, because control often looks like improvement. Cleaner space, better routines, more structure, more efficiency. But the difference is consent, choice, ownership. If someone else is deciding what's better for you and implementing it without your agreement, it stops being help, even if the outcome looks positive. For a while after she left, I kept catching myself doing small things differently. Waking up and checking the time like I expected an earlier alarm, pausing before ordering food, noticing how I moved through the day, and I had to actively remind myself I don't need to optimize everything. I don't need to justify my routine, not to someone else, not even to myself constantly. A couple of weeks later she texted me, nothing heavy, just found a place, settling in. I replied, glad to hear it. And that was it. We didn't talk about what happened, not really. And I don't think we ever will, because from her perspective she tried to help. From mine she crossed a line, and neither of us is likely to fully convince the other. But the reason this story stuck with me isn't because it ended badly. It's because of how easy it was for it to escalate without a clear moment where I could point and say, right there, that's where it went wrong. It wasn't one moment, it was a series of small steps, each one justifiable on its own. Until suddenly I didn't feel comfortable in my own home anymore, and that's a weird feeling, a quiet one, the kind you don't always notice immediately, but once you do, you can't ignore it. So yeah, if there's anything I took from this, it's this. Help that ignores your boundaries isn't really help, even if it looks like it from the outside. And if something in your own space starts feeling off, it's probably worth paying attention to that feeling sooner rather than later. Because fixing it early is a lot easier than undoing it once it's already taken over. That's where this one ends. All right, that one is a different kind of uncomfortable. Not loud, not chaotic, just that slow shift where something that starts as a favor turns into something you didn't agree to. For the next story, we're going in a slightly different direction again. This one involves a friendship that seemed completely normal for years. Until one moment makes you realize the other person has been quietly keeping track of something the entire time. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's get into it. So this one is about a friend I had for years. And when I say years, I mean the kind of friendship that just becomes part of your normal life without you really thinking about it. His name was Marcus. We met in college. Nothing dramatic, same class, ended up working on a project together, realized we got along pretty well and just kept in touch after that. He wasn't my closest friend, but he was consistent. The kind of person who's always around. You don't talk every day, but you know if you text him, he'll reply. We'd hang out occasionally, grab food, talk about random stuff, complain about work, the usual, very normal. That's important, because nothing about him seemed off at first. If anything, he came across as observant, good memory, the kind of person who remembers small details, which is usually a good thing, at least that's how I saw it for a long time. The first time I noticed something slightly strange was about a year into knowing him. We were just hanging out, nothing special. And at some point I mentioned that I'd been thinking about switching jobs, not seriously, just casually, like, yeah, I've been kind of considering it. He didn't react immediately. Just nodded, then maybe 10 minutes later, completely out of nowhere, he said, you always start thinking about changing things around this time of year. I remember laughing a little and saying, what do you mean? And he said, last year around the same time you were talking about wanting to move to a different city. Now that wasn't wrong. I had said something like that, but I had completely forgotten about it. So I said, wait, really? And he nodded like it was obvious. Yeah. Late September, same kind of conversation. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured he had a good memory. Maybe he just remembers conversations better than most people, which again isn't weird. Some people are just like that, so I brushed it off. But that wasn't the only time it happened. Over the next few months, I started noticing a pattern. He would bring up things I had said a long time ago, not just big things, small ones too. Like once I mentioned in passing that I didn't really like a certain restaurant. Months later, we were deciding where to eat, and he said, you didn't like that place last time, said the food was too salty. I had no memory of saying that. None, but it sounded like something I could have said. So again, I let it go. Then there was another moment. We were talking about music, and I mentioned liking a specific band. He immediately said, "That's new, you didn't like them last year." That one made me pause, because now it wasn't just remembering things, it was comparing them. Tracking changes, and I said, "How do you remember that?" He just shrugged. "I notice patterns." That was his answer, simple, casual, but something about it stuck, not in a bad way, just noticeable. After that, I started paying a little more attention, not intentionally at first, just awareness. And once you start noticing something like that, you start noticing it more. He'd reference conversations with surprising precision, not exact quotes, but close. Close enough that it felt like he had a clearer record of things I said than I did myself. And again, it wasn't creepy. Not yet, just unusual. If anything, it was almost impressive. Like he was just really good at remembering people. But then something happened that made it feel different, something small, but specific. And once that happened, I couldn't look at it the same way anymore. The moment that changed how I saw it wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no obvious red flag. Just one sentence, but it landed differently than everything before it. We were sitting in his car, parked outside a grocery store. I had run in to grab something, came back out, and we were just sitting there for a minute before leaving. I don't even remember what we were talking about exactly. Something random, probably work. At some point, I said something like, "Yeah, I've been kind of stressed lately." Just a throwaway comment, the kind you make without thinking. He didn't respond right away. Which wasn't unusual for him. He tended to pause before speaking sometimes. But then he said, "You usually say that right before you start cutting people off for a bit." I frowned. "Cutting people off," he nodded. "Yeah, you go quiet for like a week or two, you stop replying as much, then you come back like nothing happened." I just stared at him for a second, because that felt different. Not because it was completely wrong, but because it was specific, structured. Like he had observed it multiple times. Not just remembered something I said, but tracked a pattern in my behavior over time. I said, "I don't do that." And even as I said it, I wasn't fully sure. He shrugged. "You do." Not defensive, not argumentative, just certain, like he was stating something obvious. I tried to think back. And yeah, maybe there were times I'd been less responsive, busier, distracted, but I had never thought of it as a pattern. Certainly not one clear enough for someone else to describe like that. So I laughed it off a little and said, "Okay, analyst." He smiled slightly, didn't push it, and we moved on. But that moment stuck, because now it wasn't just him remembering what I said, it was him interpreting my behavior, categorizing it, and presenting it back to me like a conclusion. That felt different, not necessarily bad, just more personal. Over the next few days, I caught myself thinking about it more than I expected, about whether he was right, about whether I actually did that, and then I realized something that made me pause. I started paying attention to myself differently, not in a big way, just small things, like noticing how often I replied to messages, or how long I went without reaching out to people. And I didn't like that, because it felt like I had been handed a version of myself that I hadn't consciously agreed with, but now I couldn't ignore. A few days later, we hung out again, nothing unusual, just grabbing food, talking about random stuff. And at one point, I deliberately mentioned something slightly different than I had said before. Not a lie, just a variation. I said I'd been thinking about going to the gym more regularly, which was true, but I had mentioned something similar months ago and then dropped it, so I was curious what he would say. He didn't respond immediately, just nodded. Then, a few minutes later, he said, "You say that every couple of months." There it was again, that same pattern, recognition, comparison, summary, and the way he said it, it wasn't judgmental, but it wasn't neutral either. It felt like evaluation, like he was measuring consistency, tracking intent versus follow-through. I said, "Okay, but people think about things more than once." He nodded, "Yeah. You just don't act on them most of the time." That one landed harder, not because it was necessarily wrong, but because it felt like he had been quietly collecting data about me over time, and now he was presenting conclusions, casually, like it was normal. That's when the feeling shifted, just slightly. From "this guy has a good memory" to something else, something I couldn't fully name yet, but I could feel it, because suddenly every conversation felt a little different. Like it wasn't just a conversation anymore, it was being recorded, not literally, but mentally, logged, stored, and potentially brought back later. That's when I started wondering how much had he actually been paying attention this whole time, and more importantly, why. After that conversation, I couldn't just ignore it anymore. Not because I thought Marcus was doing something malicious, but because once you notice a pattern like that, you start seeing it everywhere. And the worst part is you don't know where the line is, so I decided to test it, not in some elaborate way, just small things, subtle things that wouldn't matter if I was wrong. The first thing I tried was simple. I told him something slightly inaccurate, not a big lie, just off. We were talking about movies, and I casually said I didn't like a film that I actually did like, just to see if he would correct me. He didn't. He just nodded and said, "Yeah, that makes sense." That threw me off a bit, because I expected him to say something like, "Didn't you say you liked that before?" But he didn't, which made me question everything again. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe he just remembered some things and not others. Maybe there wasn't a system behind it. Then about a week later, we were talking again. different topic, and completely out of nowhere, he said, "It's weird how you flip opinions sometimes." I blinked. About what? He said, "Like that movie you said you didn't like. You told me last year it was one of your favorites." There it was, delayed, not immediate, but stored and brought up later. That felt different because now it wasn't just recall, it was timing. He didn't correct me in the moment, he waited, then referenced it later. That's when I realized something important. He wasn't just remembering things, he was choosing when to use that information. And that made it feel a lot less random. After that, I started paying even closer attention, not just to what he remembered, but when he brought it up. And once I started looking for that, the pattern became clearer. He didn't interrupt, he didn't correct you immediately, he let things play out. Then at some point later, he'd bring it back, usually in a way that reframed the conversation, or subtly shifted the tone. Like once I mentioned being busy and not having much time lately. He didn't react, just nodded. Then maybe 15 minutes later he said, "You always say you're busy when you're avoiding something." That one stuck because it didn't feel like an observation anymore. It felt like a conclusion, a label, and it wasn't just about remembering something I said. It was about interpreting it, assigning meaning to it, and saying it out loud like it was fact. I said, "I'm not avoiding anything." He shrugged, maybe not consciously. And yeah, that's the kind of response that's hard to push back against, because it moves the argument into a place where you can't easily prove anything. It's not about facts anymore, it's about interpretation. And he always spoke like his interpretation was correct, not aggressively, not arrogantly, just confidently, like he had enough data to support it. That's when the discomfort really started to settle in. Because now every conversation felt slightly weighted, like anything I said could be stored, analyzed, and brought back later in a different context. And I started noticing something else too. He remembered things other people didn't. Conversations from months ago, details I barely remembered sharing, small preferences, offhand comments, all of it, but he didn't talk about it all the time, only when it was useful or relevant or interesting to him, which made it feel intentional. Not just a personality trait. At one point I asked him directly, "How do you remember all this stuff?" He thought about it for a second, then said, "I don't try to remember everything." I waited. He continued, "Just the things that repeat." That answer sat with me because it explained a lot. He wasn't tracking everything, he was tracking patterns, repetition, consistency, change, which meant he wasn't just remembering me, he was building a model of me. And that realization made something in my chest tighten a little, because that's not how most friendships work, at least not consciously. Most people don't analyze each other like that, they just interact. But with him, it started to feel like every interaction was part of something larger, something he was quietly constructing over time, and I didn't know what he was doing with it. The weirdest part wasn't that Marcus noticed patterns, it was that after a while I started noticing them too, or at least I started seeing myself through the version of me that he seemed to have assembled, and I really didn't like that. Because once someone consistently presents you with these tidy little summaries of your own behavior, it becomes hard not to start checking yourself against them. Not all at once, just in small ways. Like I'd be about to ignore a text for a while, and I'd think, is this the part where I go quiet for a week or two? Or I'd mention wanting to change something in my life and immediately hear his voice in my head, "You say that every couple of months." And suddenly the thought didn't feel like my own anymore. It felt prejudged, measured before I had even finished having it. That was the first time it actually started bothering me on a deeper level, because now it wasn't just that he was observant. It was that his observations had started colonizing space in my head, which sounds dramatic, but I don't really know a better way to describe it. He had this habit of turning messy human, in-the-moment behavior into neat patterns. And once he handed those patterns back to me, they were hard to shake off. A couple weeks later, we were out getting coffee, and I noticed myself doing something I'd never done before. I was editing what I said in real time, not a lot, just enough. He asked me how work had been, and my first instinct was to say I'd been thinking about making some changes. But then I stopped because I could already predict what he might say. Something about me always wanting change around the same time of year. Something about me thinking about things more than doing them. So instead I just said, "It's been fine." He looked at me for a second longer than usual and said, "You're being vague." I laughed and shrugged it off. But internally I had that very uncomfortable realization. I was filtering myself because I didn't want to hear the patterned version of my own thoughts come back at me. That's not a nice feeling in a friendship. It makes conversations start to feel less like talking and more like producing material. And once that feeling sets in, it changes everything. Then there was one specific moment that really stayed with me. We were walking back from dinner and somehow the conversation turned to relationships. Not mine specifically, just relationships in general. At some point, I made some casual comment about how I tend to pull back a bit when people get too intense too quickly. Again, not a confession. Some huge emotional reveal, just an offhand remark. Marcus was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Yeah, but only when you think the other person sees you more clearly than you see yourself." I stopped walking for half a second, not dramatically, but enough to feel it, because that didn't sound like a remembered detail. That sounded like analysis, deep analysis, the kind that assumes access to motives I hadn't even fully named to myself. I asked, what does that mean? And he said, you don't like being pinned down psychologically. Just like that, calm, certain, like he was pointing out something obvious about the weather. I remember laughing, but it came out thinner than I meant it to. I said, that's a pretty intense thing to say. He shrugged. Is it wrong? That was the thing with him. He never pushed in an emotional way. He didn't demand agreement. He just offered interpretations with this quiet confidence that made you either reject them outright or sit with them way longer than you wanted to. And because some of them contained a grain of truth, they lingered. That one lingered a lot. Not because I thought he had me all figured out, but because I hated how quickly my brain started checking whether he might be partly right. And that to me was the real issue. Not that he noticed things, not even that he was often accurate. It was that he inserted himself into the process by which I understood myself. That felt invasive in a way I couldn't easily explain to anyone else. Because if you describe it out loud, it sounds almost flattering. Oh, your friend is perceptive. Oh, he remembers details. Oh, he knows you really well. But that wasn't what it felt like from the inside. From the inside, it felt like being slowly reduced into a set of recurring tendencies by someone who seemed much more interested in consistency than context. And human beings are all context. That was what kept bothering me. He'd take something I said or did, line it up with 2 or 3 old moments, and then present a pattern as if the pattern was more real than whatever I was actually feeling right now. Maybe sometimes it was, but sometimes it absolutely was. And he didn't seem that interested in the difference. That's when I started wondering whether he did this with everyone or just with me. So a few days later, I brought him up in conversation with another mutual friend. Not in a serious way, just casually. I said something like, does Marcus ever remember weirdly specific things you've said? Our friend laughed immediately and said, yeah, all the time. He's like a vault. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me more curious. So I asked, does it ever feel weird? There was a pause. Then our friend said, sometimes. Why? And that one word, sometimes, did more for me than I expected. Because suddenly I knew this wasn't entirely in my head. I wasn't the only person who had ever felt that slight friction between being known and being studied. I didn't push further in that conversation, but after that I started looking at Marcus a little differently. Not like a dangerous person, not like some mastermind. Just someone whose way of relating to people might be a lot more analytical than I had initially realized. And once I saw that, it became hard to relax around him the same way. Once I started seeing Marcus as analytical instead of just observant, a lot of our conversations started feeling different. Not fake, not scripted. Just guided, and I don't mean in some obvious manipulative way. He wasn't putting words in my mouth. He wasn't leading with dramatic questions. Subtler than that, he had this way of circling a topic until you gave him something useful. That's the best way I can describe it. He'd start broad, keep things casual, then narrow, a little here, a little there. And by the time you realized the conversation had become oddly specific, you'd already given him enough material to build one of those tidy conclusions he liked so much. I started noticing the shape of it. For example, he'd ask something harmless like, how, work been? I'd answer normally, then he'd follow with busy or mentally draining, which sounds normal enough, right? But then if I said mentally draining, he'd ask, because of the people or because you don't care about it anymore? Again, not outrageous, just narrowing. And if I answered that, he'd go one level deeper, until somehow we'd gone from a normal catch-up to him making some oddly polished statement about my patterns, motivations, or avoidance habits. The first time I consciously noticed him doing that, I felt this weird snap of recognition. Like, oh, you're not just good at remembering, you're also good at extracting. That realization sat badly with me, because remembering what someone freely tells you is one thing. Structuring conversations to produce usable psychological material is different, even if the person doing it thinks they're just being insightful. A week or 2 after that, I decided to test that too. Nothing dramatic, I just became more careful, a little less open-ended, a little less willing to keep following his line of questioning when I could feel it narrowing, and the difference was immediate. One evening we were getting dinner and he asked how I'd been. I said, fine, just tired. Normally that would have been enough to open a whole chain of follow-up questions. Instead, when he asked, tired how? I just shrugged and said, normal tired. He looked at me for a second. Then asked, normal for you or normal in general? That question almost made me smile because it was such a perfect example of what he did. Take a broad answer, divide it, push for specificity, create structure. I just said, I don't know, just tired. And for one of the first times I could remember, he seemed slightly thrown off, not upset, just missing traction. The conversation moved on, but the energy shifted a little. That happened again a few days later. He asked if I'd been seeing anyone. I said, not really. He asked, not really as in no, or not really as in complicated. And that right there was exactly the mechanism. He was always trying to sort things into clearer categories than they naturally existed in. No ambiguity, no messy middle. Everything had to become more precise so it could be interpreted. This time I just laughed and said, you really hate vague answers, huh? He smiled and said, they usually hide the interesting part. That line stayed with me because I think it explained a lot. To Marcus, vagueness wasn't just vagueness. It was concealment, a sign that something underneath was more real, more important, more revealing. And that meant he treated ordinary conversational boundaries like surfaces to get past, not aggressively, just persistently. Like if he kept refining the question, he'd eventually arrive at the truth. But the truth is, not everybody wants to be distilled like that. Sometimes vague is just vague. Sometimes tired is just tired. Sometimes a person hasn't fully formed their own thoughts yet and doesn't want someone else shaping them into a conclusion prematurely. I don't think Marcus understood that. Or maybe he did, but valued the pattern more than the comfort of the person he was talking to. That possibility started bothering me more. Then one night it got a little too obvious to ignore. We were at a mutual friend's place with a few other people, very relaxed, nothing serious. At some point the conversation split into smaller groups and Marcus and I ended up talking near the kitchen. I mentioned casually that I'd been thinking about taking a short trip somewhere by myself. Just a thought, not a plan. He nodded and said, that usually means you're trying to reset. I said, or maybe I just want a trip. He smiled slightly. Yeah, but with you it's usually a reset signal. There it was again, that same move. Take a present statement, slot it into an existing theory and make the theory feel more real than the statement itself. I let that one go. But a few minutes later one of our friends wandered over and asked what we were talking about. Before I could answer, Marcus said, he's in one of his withdrawal phases. Just like that, light tone, almost joking. Everybody kind of laughed, including me, because what else are you supposed to do in the moment? But inside, something turned. Because that was the first time he had publicly applied one of his private frameworks to me, not just in conversation with me, not just as some weirdly insightful comment one-on-one. He had taken his internal model of my behavior and casually presented it to someone else like it was established fact, that felt different, that felt violating in a way the other stuff hadn't quite reached. I brushed it off in the moment, said something like, don't let him diagnose me over appetizers. People laughed, the moment passed, but the feeling didn't, because suddenly I had a new question. How often did Marcus think about people in those terms when they weren't around? And how often did he talk about them that way? After that night, I started noticing something I really wish I hadn't. Marcus didn't just seem to build little private theories about people. He seemed to use them socially, not in a cruel, obvious way, not like he was openly mocking anyone or exposing secrets. It was more subtle than that. He'd make these tiny summarizing comments about people that sounded insightful enough to pass as harmless, but confident enough that other people would absorb them. And once I started noticing it, I saw it everywhere. A mutual friend would cancel plans, and Marcus would say something like, he always flakes when he feels out of control. Someone else would get quiet during a group conversation, and Marcus would casually say, she does that when she feels underestimated. Always in that same tone, calm, observational, almost thoughtful, like he was helping everyone understand each other better. And maybe that was how he saw it, but from where I was standing it didn't feel generous. It felt like he was reducing people into tidy little behavioral summaries, and then feeding those summaries back into the group until they started sticking. That was the part that got under my skin, because once a person gets described a certain way often enough, even lightly, the description starts floating around independently of them. It becomes social shorthand, and social shorthand is dangerous because it sounds efficient while flattening everything it touches. After I noticed that, I started paying attention to how people reacted when Marcus did it. Usually they laughed a little, or nodded, or said something like, honestly, yeah, that's true. Not because he was always right, but because he was often plausible. That's the power of someone who speaks in patterns. They don't need perfect accuracy. They just need enough recognizability for people to go along with it. And once they do, the pattern hardens. A few days later, I got coffee with one of our mutual friends, Lena. At some point, she brought up another friend who had been distant lately, and before I even thought about it, I heard myself almost saying, yeah, he does that when he's overwhelmed. I stopped halfway through the sentence, because I realized with this weird little jolt that it sounded exactly like Marcus. That really bothered me, not because the thought itself was impossible, but because I could feel how contagious his way of talking about people was, how easily it slid into your own language once you spent enough time around it. It gave everything this false sense of clarity, like the complexity of another person could be condensed into one neat, repeated mechanism. And the more I noticed that influence, the less comfortable I felt around him. Then something happened that moved it from unsettling to personal again. I was with a couple of friends at someone's apartment, Marcus included, just a very normal low-key hangout. At one point, I stepped out onto the balcony to take a phone call. It wasn't a secretive call, just something I wanted to handle privately because it was family-related. I was out there for maybe 10 minutes. When I came back in, the room was quiet in that specific way where you can tell a conversation just changed shape. Not dead silent, just subtly rearranged. Nobody said anything weird right away, but the energy felt slightly off. I sat back down and one of my friends asked in a very casual tone, everything okay with your family? Now that question on its own was normal, completely normal. too normal maybe. I said yeah, everything was fine, just a check-in, and that should have been that. But later that night, after most people had gone home, Lena texted me. She said, just so you know, while you were outside, Marcus said you get distant whenever family stuff comes up. I stared at that message for a long time, because again, maybe it wasn't completely baseless. Maybe there had been moments in the past where I'd pulled back a little during stressful family situations, but that wasn't the point. The point was that I stepped away to take one phone call, and within 10 minutes Marcus had apparently turned that into a behavioral explanation about me for the room. Not to me, about me, that really changed something, because until then I could still tell myself his pattern making was just how he related one-on-one. Weird maybe, a little invasive but still contained. Now I knew it wasn't contained. He was doing it socially, and not just in broad, generic ways. He was using current moments as evidence in real time, quietly slotting people back into his existing frameworks and sharing those frameworks with others as if they were useful context. I asked Lena exactly what he said. She replied, basically that when family gets involved you start acting more detached and harder to read. I read that message 3 or 4 times. What bothered me wasn't just that he'd said it, it was how polished it sounded, how ready. Like he had a whole file on me in his head and only needed a small trigger to open the relevant section. And I know that sounds dramatic, I do, but that's honestly how it started to feel around him. Like any current behavior could be instantly absorbed into a larger theory he was already carrying around. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about one thing. It's one thing to feel observed by someone. It's another thing to realize they may also be narrating you to other people. That's a much stranger kind of discomfort, because now it's not just about how they see you. It's about whether their version of you is quietly moving through your social circle when you're not even in the room. And once that thought entered my head, I couldn't really put it back. After Lena told me what he'd said, I couldn't just ignore it anymore. Up until that point, I had been trying to keep everything in that grey zone. Maybe he's just observant. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe it's harmless. But this wasn't harmless anymore. This was him describing me to other people without me there, and doing it like it was useful context. So I decided I needed to talk to him, not aggressively, not confrontational, just directly. A couple days later, we met up like usual, nothing special, just coffee. For the first 10 minutes, we talked about normal stuff, work, random things, nothing heavy, but I couldn't really focus on any of it. Because I already knew where the conversation was going. So eventually I just said, hey, can I ask you something? He nodded. Yeah, I said, do you talk about people like patterns when they're not around? He didn't react immediately, just looked at me for a second, then said, what do you mean? I held his gaze and said, like you described them, their behavior, why they do things. There was a pause, not long, but noticeable. Then he said, sometimes, just like that. No hesitation, no denial, no attempt to soften it. That actually caught me off guard a bit because I expected at least some deflection. So I said, okay, why? He leaned back slightly and said, it helps me understand people better. That answer sounded so reasonable on the surface, too reasonable. I said, understand them for what? He shrugged. For interacting with them, for predicting things, for not being surprised. Predicting, that word stuck immediately. Because that's what it had been feeling like the whole time. Like he wasn't just listening to people, he was trying to map them. So I said, do you ever think that's kind of invasive? He didn't look offended, didn't get defensive. He just tilted his head slightly like he was genuinely considering it. Then he said, invasive how? That question told me everything, because it meant he didn't already see it that way. I said, like, you're taking things people say casually, or how they act in a moment, and turning it into these fixed explanations about them. He nodded slowly. Patterns aren't fixed, they're probabilistic. That response actually made me laugh a little, not because it was funny, but because it was so him, clinical, precise, detached, like we were talking about data, not people. I said, you know that makes it worse, right? He raised an eyebrow slightly. How? I leaned forward a bit and said, because you're not just describing people, you're treating them like something you can model. He didn't respond right away, and for the first time in that entire conversation, he looked like he was actually thinking, not just responding, thinking. Then he said, I mean, everyone models people, most just do it unconsciously. That's probably true, at least to some extent, but again, that wasn't the point. I said, yeah, but most people don't say it out loud, and they definitely don't say it to other people like it's a fact. There was a pause, then I added, you told people I get distant when family stuff comes up. He looked at me for a second, then said, sometimes you do. No apology, no hesitation, just confirmation. That hit harder than I expected, not because of the content, but because of the delivery. There was no awareness that saying that might be crossing a line. It was just information, I said, that's not something you get to decide for other people. He shook his head slightly. I'm not deciding, I'm observing. Again, that same framing, observation, neutral, objective, as if removing intention made it harmless. I let out a breath and said, that doesn't make it okay. And for the first time he pushed back a little, not emotionally, but more firmly. How is it not okay to notice patterns in people? I said, it's not about noticing. It's about what you do with it. He didn't interrupt, so I continued, you're not just noticing things, you're presenting them like they define people, and you're doing it when they're not even there to respond. That seemed to land a little, not fully, but enough. He went quiet for a few seconds, then said, I don't think of it as defining people. I asked, then what? He answered, as understanding them more accurately than surface-level interaction. And that right there. That was the core of it. He genuinely believed his version of people was more accurate than what they presented in the moment, that his patterns were closer to the truth than their own explanations. That's why it didn't feel invasive to him. It felt correct, useful. I leaned back and said, that's exactly the problem. He looked at me, waiting, so I said, you're replacing what people actually say and feel with what you think is the underlying pattern, and then treating that like it's more real. There was a long pause, the longest one we'd had, and for a second I thought maybe that would be the moment where it clicked, where he'd realize how that might feel from the other side. But instead he just said, I don't see why that's inherently bad. And yeah, that was the moment I understood something very clearly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something I could explain in a different way and suddenly fix. We were operating on completely different assumptions about what it means to relate to people. For him, understanding meant reducing, clarifying, finding patterns. For me, understanding meant leaving space for inconsistency, for context, for change, and those two things don't really coexist easily. After that conversation, things didn't explode. No fight, no dramatic ending. No moment where one of us stood up and said, well, I guess that's it. It was quieter than that. And honestly, that made it feel more final. We finished our coffee, talked a little more, but not really about anything important, just surface stuff. The kind of conversation people have when something essential has already shifted underneath it and both of them know it. When we left, everything looked normal from the outside. We said bye, went home. That was it. But after that, I noticed I stopped reaching out first. Not consciously at first, just naturally, or maybe not naturally. Maybe carefully, because once I understood that Marcus genuinely didn't see a problem with what he was doing, something in me relaxed away from the friendship instead of toward it. I didn't feel angry. That's the strange part. I felt unwilling. Unwilling to keep feeding a dynamic that made me feel translated all the time. That's the word I kept coming back to afterward. Translated. Like every messy, unfinished, contradictory thing I said around him risked being turned into a cleaner explanation than I actually wanted. And after a while, that makes you tired. So I became a little slower to reply, a little less available, a little less inclined to meet up one-on-one, not as some passive-aggressive strategy, just because I didn't enjoy it the same way anymore. And I think he noticed. Of course he noticed. That almost makes me laugh now. Because if anyone was going to detect a shift in pattern, it was him. He texted a couple of times asking if everything was good. Very normal messages, nothing weird, and I answered normally, because technically everything was good, or at least nothing dramatic had happened. I just didn't want the same level of closeness anymore. And that's a hard thing to explain when the reason isn't some obvious betrayal. It's harder to say, I don't like the way you hold people in your mind, than it is to point to one concrete event and call it done. A few weeks later, we ended up at the same birthday dinner for a mutual friend. That was the first time I'd really spent time around him since the conversation. And the weird thing was he seemed completely normal, friendly, relaxed, still funny, still easy to talk to in short bursts. If someone had dropped into that dinner without context, they would have thought nothing at all was off, which honestly made the whole thing feel stranger, because it reminded me that a lot of uncomfortable dynamics don't look alarming from the outside, they just feel subtly wrong from the inside. At some point during dinner, someone brought up a job decision they were trying to make. Nothing serious, just one of those casual group conversations where everybody throws in opinions. Marcus started to say something, one of those familiar, polished little pattern statements, and I felt this immediate internal resistance before he'd even finished the sentence. Not fear, not even irritation, just no, a quiet, instinctive no. I didn't want to hear another person turned into a framework, and the fact that my body reacted before my brain fully did told me a lot. That's usually how you know something has gotten under your skin in a real way. After that dinner, I accepted something I'd been avoiding. I didn't need a dramatic reason to take a step back from someone. Discomfort, if it's consistent enough, is reason enough. You don't need a courtroom case to change the level of access someone has to you. That was actually a useful lesson for me because I think for a long time I assumed relationships had to end for clear, publicly defensible reasons. A betrayal, a lie, a big conflict, something you could explain cleanly. But sometimes the reason is just, I don't feel like myself around you anymore, and that counts. Over time, Marcus drifted into the category of person I still saw socially sometimes, but no longer shared much with directly. Group settings, fine. Surface conversation, fine. Anything personal, half-formed, or emotionally messy, not anymore. And once I made that adjustment, I felt better almost immediately. Lighter, less edited, less aware of my own words as future evidence. That feeling told me I had made the right call. A few months after all of this, I was talking to Lena again, and Marcus came up briefly. Nothing major, just some passing comment, and she said something interesting. She said, he's very good at making people feel understood right up until the moment they feel categorized. That was it. That was the sentence I wish I'd heard earlier, because that's exactly what had bothered me and I hadn't been able to name it cleanly. At first, being remembered feels good. Being noticed can feel flattering. Having someone connect dots about you can even feel intimate. But there's a point where understanding tips over into categorizing, and once that happens, the warmth drains out of it. You stop feeling seen and start feeling sorted. That's a very different experience. And I think Marcus either didn't know where that line was or didn't think it mattered. Maybe for some people it doesn't. Maybe some people genuinely like being interpreted that way. Maybe it feels clarifying to them. But for me, it felt like there was less and less room to simply be inconsistent, unfinished, or hard to summarize. And that room matters, probably more than most people realize. So yeah, that's basically where this story ends. No villain, no major reveal, just a friendship that quietly changed shape once I realized the other person wasn't only listening to me. He was building internal explanations of me and trusting them a little more than I was comfortable with. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't really go back. If there's any takeaway from this one, I think it's this. There's a difference between being known and being interpreted. And once someone starts treating their interpretation of you as more reliable than your own present reality, something important gets lost. Maybe not all at once, maybe not loudly, but enough. Enough that eventually you stop wanting to hand them more of yourself to organize. That's where this one ends. All right, that one is uncomfortable in a very specific way. Because on paper, it almost sounds flattering. Someone remembers things, notices patterns, seems to get people. But then you realize there's a point where that stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like you've been mentally filed away. For the next story, we're shifting again. This one starts with something way more ordinary. A neighbor, a favor, and one of those situations that seems mildly annoying at first. But the more it goes on, the clearer it becomes that this person isn't confused, forgetful, or harmless. They're just testing what they can get away with. Let's get into the next one. Deyer elarikratkoi karakaralu chershaya, so this one starts with a neighbor. And honestly, at the beginning, it didn't feel like anything worth remembering. Just one of those small, everyday interactions that happen when you live in an apartment building long enough. Her name was Sandra. She lived 2 doors down from me. We weren't friends. We weren't even really acquaintances. Just the usual hey in the hallway, occasional polite small talk, nothing more. She was probably in her mid-40s, lived alone as far as I knew, always seemed put together, the kind of person who notices everything going on around them. Which again isn't unusual. Some people are just like that. The first real interaction we had was about 4 months ago. I was coming back from work, juggling groceries, keys, phone, the usual mess, when she stepped out into the hallway and said, "Hey, quick question." I stopped, shifted the bags, and said, "Yeah." She pointed at one of my grocery bags and said, "Did you happen to grab extra milk by any chance?" That caught me a little off guard, but not in a bad way, just unexpected. I said, yeah, actually." She smiled immediately. "Oh, perfect, I forgot to pick some up and I really need it for something tonight. Could I borrow it? I'll replace it tomorrow." Now, that's one of those situations where saying no feels unnecessarily difficult. It's just milk, it's not a big deal. So I said, "Yeah, sure," and handed it over. She thanked me, said she'd bring it back the next day, and went back into her apartment. Simple, normal, completely forgettable, and honestly I did forget about it, until the next day passed, and the next, no milk, no mention of it, which again, not a huge deal, it's milk. I wasn't going to knock on her door over something that small, so I let it go. A few days later, I ran into her again in the hallway. She smiled, said hi, and started chatting like nothing had happened. And for a second, I thought about bringing it up, just casually like, "Hey, about the milk," but I didn't, because it felt petty. And that's kind of how it started, small enough to ignore, but just noticeable enough to stick in the back of your mind. A couple days after that, it happened again. I was unlocking my door when she stepped out and said, "Hey, do you happen to have any spare trash bags?" Same tone. Same casual delivery, like it was no big deal, and technically it was. So I said, "Yeah, I think so," grabbed a roll from inside and handed it to her. She said, "Thanks, I'll give you some back later." Sound familiar because it was, same structure, same promise, and again no follow-up, no replacement, no mention. That's when I started noticing the pattern. Not consciously at first, just recognition, a small request, a casual promise to replace it, then nothing. And because each individual thing was so minor, it never felt worth addressing directly. Which, looking back, I think she understood very well, because over the next couple of weeks the requests became more frequent. Still small, still reasonable, still just enough to make you feel like saying no would be unnecessary. A charger, a couple of eggs, some paper towels, always something simple, always something temporary, always with the same line at the end, "I'll replace it," and then nothing. No replacements, no acknowledgement, just the next request, and the weird part wasn't even the stuff itself. It was how normal she acted every time. No hesitation, no awkwardness. No sense that she was asking for something she hadn't returned before, like every request existed in isolation, disconnected from the last one, and I started to feel something I couldn't quite define yet. Not anger, not even irritation, just a growing sense that something wasn't lining up. Because this didn't feel like forgetfulness. It felt consistent, intentional almost, like she was operating on a system I hadn't fully seen yet, and once that thought crossed my mind, I couldn't really unsee it. After a few weeks of this, I started keeping track, not formally, not writing anything down, just noticing. Because at a certain point, it stopped feeling like a series of small favors and started feeling like a pattern with structure. And the structure was always the same. She'd ask casually, I'd say yes, she'd promise to replace it. She wouldn't. Then a few days later, something new. No overlap, no acknowledgement of the previous thing, just a clean reset each time, and that's what made it weird. Because if it had been forgetfulness, there would have been at least some hesitation. Some, oh, I still owe you from last time. Some awareness, but there wasn't any. It was like each request existed in its own separate timeline. At some point, I mentally ran through everything I'd given her. Milk, trash bags, eggs, paper towels, a phone charger she said she'd only need for a few hours. That one never came back either. Again, none of it was expensive. None of it was worth confronting someone over individually, but together it started to feel like something else. Like I was slowly becoming a supply point. That's the best way I can describe it. Not a neighbor doing occasional favors. A resource. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. She never asked for the same thing twice. Not once. Every request was different, which meant she wasn't just forgetting. She was cycling, using something once, not returning it, then moving on to something new. That felt deliberate, because if she had asked for the same item again, it would have forced the issue. It would have reminded me, or created an obvious moment to say, hey, what about last time? But by always changing the item, she avoided that, which meant the only way to address it would be to bring up a list of small things all at once. And that feels awkward, almost disproportionate, like you're overreacting, and I think she knew that. That's when I started wondering whether this was less about the items and more about the dynamic, so I decided to test something. Again, nothing dramatic, just a small shift. The next time she asked for something, I said no, not aggressively. Not confrontational, just no. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I had just gotten home, keys in the door when she stepped out like usual. Hey, quick question. Same tone, same setup. She asked if I had any spare batteries. I actually did, but this time I said, sorry, I don't. Simple, neutral, and I watched her reaction carefully, because I expected at least a hint of surprise, or disappointment, or even just a slight pause, but there was none. She smiled immediately and said, oh, no worries, and that was it, no push, no second attempt, no are you sure, just a clean acceptance. Then she went back into her apartment, and that was the moment I knew for sure, because it didn't feel like someone who genuinely needed batteries and was slightly inconvenienced. It felt like someone who had just tested a boundary and moved on. No friction, no emotional investment, just data. And that realization changed how I saw everything that had happened before, because suddenly all those small requests didn't feel random anymore. They felt like probes. Low cost, low risk ways to see what I'd give, how easily I'd give it, and whether I'd ever push back, and for weeks I hadn't, which meant from her perspective the system worked. A couple days passed, no interaction. Then on Friday it happened again. Hey, do you happen to have any spare light bulbs? Different item. Same tone, same setup. And again I said, no sorry. Same reaction, immediate smile. No worries, back into her apartment. No hesitation, no change in demeanor. That consistency told me everything I needed to know. Because most people, when they're genuinely asking for help, show some variation, some emotion, some adjustment, but she didn't. Her behavior was stable, predictable, like the outcome didn't really matter, only the attempt. That's when I realized something slightly unsettling. The requests weren't really about the items. They were about access, and I had been giving it freely, until now. After I said no those 2 times, things went quiet for a few days. No hallway requests, no casual, quick question. No little knocks at the door. At first I thought maybe that was it. Maybe she had just gotten the message. Maybe the dynamic had reset, and honestly, part of me was relieved. Because I still didn't want this to become some weird neighbor conflict. I wasn't trying to make a point, I just wanted the pattern to stop. Then the following week I came home and found something on my doormat. It was a note, folded once, my name written on the front in neat handwriting. I picked it up, opened it, and it said, hey, sorry I missed you. I'm having a small issue with a package delivery tomorrow and might need someone to grab it for me if I'm not home. Around, could you text me? Sandra, she had written her number underneath. Now on its own, that's not a weird note, not really. People help neighbors with packages all the time. And this was exactly the kind of thing that again would feel strange to refuse. It wasn't borrowing an object, it was a favor, a temporary one, low effort, perfectly reasonable. And that's why it immediately made me pause, because it felt like a shift, a cleaner kind of ask, less traceable than borrowed items. Less obvious, something that would let the same dynamic continue without looking like the same dynamic. I stood there in my doorway reading the note twice, then I just set it on the counter and left it there. I didn't text her. The next day around lunch, there was a knock at my door. I opened it and there she was, smiling like always, holding her phone. Hey, she said, just wanted to make sure you saw my note. I said, yeah, I saw it. She nodded. Okay, great. I have to step out later and the delivery window is kind of vague, so if it comes while I'm gone, could you just grab it and hold it for me? Again, very normal, very reasonable. So normal, in fact, that I almost said yes automatically, but something in me resisted. Not because the task itself was a big deal, but because I could feel the structure of it, the assumption. The way she moved from note to follow-up without ever acknowledging the recent no's, like she was simply trying a new door after the old one stopped opening. So I said I might not be around, which was truish. I worked from home, but I didn't want to commit. She tilted her head just slightly, not confused, assessing. Then she smiled and said, "That's okay if you just keep an eye out." And there it was again, no pushback, no disappointment, just a smooth adjustment. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock somewhere down the hall, then voices, then the sound of a package being dragged or shifted. A few minutes later, I opened my door to take out trash and saw a box sitting outside Sandra's apartment. Not mine to touch, not my problem, so I left it alone. That evening, I ran into her in the hallway and she said, "Oh good, it got there. Not thanks for checking. Not did you see it, just, it got there." Like the note and follow-up had been part of some test run that she was now marking complete. That feeling stuck with me, because once again the actual item hadn't mattered. The ask had, the willingness, the access point. Over the next week or so, more of these favor-shaped requests showed up. Not borrowing exactly, just tiny things that required my involvement. Can you buzz someone in if they come early? Could you keep an eye out for a maintenance guy? If I leave this bag by your door for a few minutes, is that okay? Each one completely small, each one easy to justify on its own, and each one designed in some subtle way to pull me into handling part of her life. That was when I really understood what bothered me. It wasn't the value of what she took. It was the expectation she was building, a kind of ambient availability. As if living near me meant she could gradually draft me into becoming a buffer, backup, or convenience layer whenever she needed one. And because none of the asks were outrageous, saying no to all of them made me feel difficult, which I suspect was part of why this worked. Then one evening, something happened that made the pattern impossible to dismiss as harmless. I got home and found a small grocery bag hanging from my doorknob. Inside was a carton of milk, a roll of trash bags, and a sticky note. The note said, "Little replacement for a few of the things from before. Also, if you're home tomorrow morning, can you sign for something for me?" I actually stood there in the hallway and laughed once, just out of disbelief. Because this was the first time she had acknowledged any of it, but not really, not in a genuine way. It wasn't, "Hey, I realized I never returned your stuff. Sorry." It wasn't even specific. Just a vague little replacement, bundled directly with a new request. Like repayment wasn't repayment, it was an investment in continued access. That changed everything for me, because now it felt obvious. She wasn't absent-minded, she wasn't scattered, she wasn't some lonely neighbor being awkward about asking for help. She understood the transaction perfectly. She just kept it imbalanced on purpose. Enough repayment to reset goodwill, never enough to close the loop. And always attached to the next ask. I took the bag inside, stared at the note for another minute, then set it on the counter next to the first one. And that night, for the first time, I started thinking less about whether she was pushy and more about whether she was strategic. After that replacement bag, something shifted again, not in what she asked, but in how she behaved. Up until that point, everything had still technically been a request, even if it was patterned. Even if it was calculated, it was still framed as, "Hey, can you?" After that, it started feeling more like, "You will unless you stop it." And that's a very different dynamic. The first time I noticed it clearly was 2 days later. I came home in the evening and saw a small package sitting right outside my door. Not hers, mine, but placed in a way that suggested it had been moved, like it had originally been delivered somewhere else. I picked it up, unlocked my door, and as I stepped inside, I noticed something else. There was a second box, leaning against my wall, just to the side, not addressed to me, addressed to Sandra. I paused, because I hadn't agreed to anything. I hadn't said I'd be available. I hadn't even responded to the note about signing for something. And yet there it was, her package, at my door, like it had been placed there on purpose. I stood there for a few seconds just looking at it. Then I did something very deliberate. I didn't move it. I left it exactly where it was, went inside, closed the door, and waited. About 15 minutes later, there was a knock. Of course there was. I opened the door and Sandra was standing there, smiling like usual. "Hey, thanks for grabbing that." I looked at her for a second, then said I didn't grab it. She blinked just once, then looked at the package, then back at me. "Oh, it was here when I got back." I nodded. "Yeah." Same for me. There was a tiny pause, barely noticeable. Then she smiled again and said, "Well, still worked out." That sentence, that was the moment it fully clicked, because it didn't matter to her how it got there. It didn't matter whether I had actually agreed. What mattered was that the outcome aligned with her expectation. The system had functioned. I said, "I didn't agree to take your package." Still calm, still neutral, but clear. She tilted her head slightly, not defensive, not apologetic. "Just adjusting. I thought you might be around." That phrasing again. Assumption framed as possibility. I said, "That's not the same as asking." She nodded slowly, then said, "Okay." Same word, same tone as before. But now I recognized it. It wasn't agreement, it was acknowledgement, a note being taken, a variable being updated. She picked up the package and said, "Good to know," and walked back to her apartment. And I stood there for a second after closing the door, feeling that same tight, quiet frustration again, because this wasn't random, it wasn't sloppy, it was iterative. She tried something, observed the result, adjusted, then tried again. And every time I didn't explicitly push back hard enough, the baseline shifted slightly in her favor. The next day it escalated again. This time no note, no conversation. I opened my door in the morning and found a small bag sitting on the floor. Inside was something that looked like groceries, bread, a couple of small items, and a sticky note that said, "Running late, might grab this later if you're around. Thanks," not a question, not even framed as a request, just a statement. With thanks already attached, like the agreement had already happened, I actually felt a flash of irritation this time. Not huge, but sharp, because now it wasn't even about subtlety anymore. She was just placing things in my space and assuming I'd take responsibility for them, without asking, without waiting for an answer. That was different. That crossed a line in a way the earlier stuff hadn't quite reached. I picked up the bag, walked down the hallway, and placed it directly in front of her door. Then I went back inside, didn't leave a note, didn't knock, just returned it. About 10 minutes later I heard her door open. Then a pause, then footsteps, then silence again. No knock on my door, no follow-up, no message, which at this point told me everything, because again, no reaction. No confrontation, no confusion, just quiet adjustment, like she was recalibrating again, testing a different angle. And that's when I realized something that made the whole situation feel a little colder. She wasn't trying to be friendly, she wasn't even trying to be liked. She was trying to establish a system, one where I functioned as a convenient extension of her routine. And the only thing that limited that system was how clearly I enforced boundaries, nothing else. After I put the grocery bag back outside her door, things went quiet again. At this point, I had started to recognize that silence for what it was. Not the end of something, just the pause between attempts. That was the pattern with Sandra. She never pushed in one continuous line. She'd try something, watch what happened, pull back just enough to avoid open conflict, then come at it from a slightly different angle. And I think that's part of why it took me so long to fully accept what was happening. Because there was never one big incident that made her look obviously unreasonable. It was all paced so carefully, small enough to excuse, frequent enough to normalize. A few days passed with almost no interaction, just the occasional hallway hello, nothing else. Then on a Thursday evening, I got home and found her standing outside her apartment with her phone in one hand and a tote bag in the other. She looked up the moment she saw me. "Oh, perfect," she said. That word alone made me tense a little. Perfect, not hey, not can I ask you something. Perfect, like my arrival had just solved a problem she had already decided I'd be part of. I said, "What's up?" She held up her phone and said, "My car service is here early and I need to run downstairs, but I've got groceries that can't just sit out here. Can you keep them inside your place for like 20 minutes? There it was, direct, immediate, time pressure built in. A favor framed as the only practical option. And because she was standing there with the bag already in hand, the whole thing was engineered to make hesitation feel unreasonable. I looked at the tote bag, then at her, then back at the bag, and I realized something. At no point did she say, "If not, that's okay." There was no release valve, no real possibility of refusal built into the way she asked. It was phrased like help was already the expected answer. I said, "No, I can't." Simple, clear, no extra explanation. For the first time in this entire sequence of interactions, her expression changed in a way that was impossible to miss. Not dramatic, not angry, but genuinely surprised, like the answer hadn't fit the script. She said, "It's literally just 20 minutes. And that line told me a lot, because now finally there it was, minimization, the little pressure move that had been hiding underneath all the previous asks. Make the request seem so small that refusal feels irrational. I said, "I still can't." She adjusted the tote bag in her hand and gave this tight little laugh. Not warm, not amused, just the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to suggest that someone else is being difficult without saying it directly. Then she said, "Okay, wow." That was new too, a little guilt, a little judgment, subtle but definitely there. And for some reason that actually made me feel calmer. Because up until then she had been so smooth about everything that it was easy to second-guess myself. But this was clearer. This was the part underneath the polished version. The part that believed access should be granted and felt annoyed when it was. I said nothing, just unlocked my door. And as I stepped inside she said, "I guess I just thought neighbors helped each other." That line was almost impressive in how efficient it was. One sentence, 3 layers. Guilt, morality, and social expectation. All wrapped in something that sounded harmless. I turned back and said, "Helping each other isn't the same as being on call." And then I went inside and closed the door. I stood there for a second afterward, keys still in my hand, heart beating a little faster than it should have been for such a small interaction. Because even though nothing dramatic had happened, I could feel very clearly that something had changed. Not in her, in me. I wasn't confused anymore. That was the shift. For weeks, maybe longer, I had kept trying to interpret her behavior generously. Forgetful, scattered, a little pushy. Maybe lonely, maybe just used to asking for favors. But after that exchange, I stopped doing that. Because people who are simply forgetful don't pivot this neatly. People who are just disorganized don't build requests around timing, convenience, and social pressure this consistently. And people who mean well usually reveal some actual embarrassment when you tell them no. Sandra didn't. She revealed annoyance. Contained annoyance, sure, but still annoyance. That mattered. The next morning, I opened my door and found nothing outside. No note, no bag, no package, nothing. And again, that silence felt strategic. Later that evening, though, I ran into another neighbor in the lobby, an older guy named Peter who lived on the first floor. We made small talk for a minute and then kind of casually he said, "Sandra asked you for stuff too." I looked at him and said, "Too?" He gave this tired little smile and said, "Yeah, she's always trying to get people to hold deliveries, lend things, let repair guys in, all that." That stopped me for a second, not because it was shocking by then, but because it confirmed something I hadn't fully let myself assume. This wasn't specific to me. It wasn't some accidental dynamic we had slipped into. It was a routine, a system she ran with whoever seemed easiest to pull into it. I asked, "Has she always been like that?" He shrugged and said, "As long as I've been here." Then he added, "She goes for the people who are polite." That line stayed with me because it was so clean, so accurate, and honestly kind of irritating, not because Peter was wrong, but because he was. Polite people make the best test subjects for this kind of thing. You don't need to overpower them. You just need to rely on the fact that they don't want to make everyday life awkward. Once I heard that, all the hallway interactions with Sandra rearranged themselves in my head. The timing, the tone, the casualness, the clean little promises, the lack of embarrassment, the quick recalibration every time something didn't work. She wasn't improvising, she was experienced. And that made the whole thing feel less annoying and more calculated. Not evil, not criminal, just deeply, repeatedly opportunistic. And honestly, that almost made it worse, because it meant she had probably been doing this for a long time to a lot of people in exactly the same small, deniable ways. After that conversation with Peter, I started noticing things I probably should have noticed earlier, not because they were hidden, but because I hadn't been looking for them. Once you realize someone operates in patterns, you start seeing the edges of those patterns everywhere. The next few days, I paid a little more attention in shared spaces, the hallway, the lobby, even the elevator, and almost immediately, I caught it. One evening I stepped into the elevator and Sandra was already inside with another neighbor I didn't know well. She was smiling, talking in that same easy, casual tone I'd heard a dozen times. "And if you're around tomorrow, could you just let the guy in? I'll only be out for like half an hour." Same structure, same phrasing, same minimization. The other neighbor hesitated for maybe half a second, then said, "Yeah, sure, I guess." Sandra smiled wider. "Perfect, thank you, perfect." There it was again. I stood there quietly, not saying anything, just listening. And for the first time, I wasn't the one being asked, which made it easier to see. Cleaner, because now there was no personal involvement clouding it. It looked exactly the same from the outside, like a script, a well-practiced one. Later that week, I ran into Peter again, this time in the hallway, and I asked him a little more directly, "Does she ever return stuff?" He laughed, not loudly. Just a short, knowing kind of laugh. "Sometimes," he said, "just enough." That phrasing stuck immediately. Just enough. I said, "What do you mean?" He leaned against the wall and said, "She'll give something back once in a while or replace something small. Keeps people from feeling like they're being used, but it never balances out." That lined up perfectly with what I had experienced. The milk, the trash bags, the random replacement bundle, not repayment, maintenance. Just enough to keep the system running. I asked, "Does anyone ever say anything to her?" He shrugged. "Not really, it's all small stuff. You end up looking like the bad guy if you make it a big deal." That was exactly it. The scale protected her. Individually, each request was too minor to justify confrontation. Collectively, they added up to something much bigger. But by the time you realized that, it was already awkward to bring up. That's a very effective setup. Then Peter said something else that really clarified the whole thing. "She doesn't go after everyone." I asked, "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the hallway and said, "She tries once or twice. If someone shuts it down early, she moves on. If they don't, she keeps going." That was it. That was the whole system in one sentence. Test, evaluate, expand, or abandon. And suddenly everything made sense. The quick acceptance when I said no, the lack of emotional reaction. The immediate shift to a different type of request. She wasn't pushing randomly. She was filtering, sorting people into categories, available, not available. And once you fell into the available category, the requests kept coming, refined, adjusted, optimized. That word kept coming back to me. Optimized, not in a high-tech way, just in that quiet, practical sense. She had found a way to extract small, useful favors from the people around her with minimal resistance. She had clearly been doing it long enough to get very good at it. A couple of days after that, I saw the same thing play out again, this time in the lobby. Sandra was talking to a younger guy who had recently moved in. I recognized that moment immediately, that early-stage tone, friendly, light, harmless. She said something about needing help with a delivery. He hesitated, then said yes, and I remember watching that and thinking, he doesn't know yet, not in a dramatic, ominous way. Just. He hasn't seen the pattern. He's still in the "this is just a neighbor being neighborly" phase, and I almost felt like saying something, not to warn him off completely, just to give him a heads up, but I didn't, because again, what would I say? "Hey, she's going to ask you for small favors over time and probably not return them consistently." That sounds ridiculous out loud, petty even, and that's part of why it works. The behavior sits in this perfect zone where it's noticeable but hard to articulate without sounding like you're overreacting. That night back in my apartment, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. This wasn't going to stop on its own. Not because of anything I said, not because of anything she said. It would only stop if I consistently stayed outside the system. No exceptions, no just this once. Because just this once was exactly how it started in the first place. And once you re-enter that pattern, you're back in it. Clean, simple, predictable, which meant the only real choice I had was whether I wanted to be part of it at all. Once I decided I was done participating, something in me settled. Not because the situation was over, but because I finally understood the rules of it. And once you understand the rules of something, it stops feeling confusing. It might still be annoying, still uncomfortable, but it's not confusing anymore. So from that point on, I kept everything simple. Polite but closed. If Sandra said hi, I said hi back. If she made small talk in the hallway, I kept it brief. If she asked for anything, the answer was no. No apology-heavy explanations. No soft maybes. Just a calm, clean no. And for about a week, that seemed to work. She didn't stop trying completely, but the attempts became smaller, more spaced out. Like she was checking whether the system was truly offline or just temporarily unresponsive. One morning it was, "Hey, do you know if the front office is open today?" Which wasn't really a favor, just a question. I said I wasn't sure. Another time it was, "Can you remind me what day trash pickup is?" Again, low stakes. Almost like she was trying to re-establish a more ordinary baseline of interaction. I answered briefly and moved on. No opening, no invitation, no friction either. And then came what turned out to be the final attempt. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had just come back from running errands, and as I got out of the elevator, I saw Sandra standing near my door, not directly in front of it, just close enough that it immediately set off that quiet internal alarm. She turned when she heard me and smiled. "Hey," she said, perfect timing. That word again, still there, still doing all the work. I stopped a few feet away and said, "What's up?" She held up a small set of keys. Not hers, at least not the ones I had seen her use before. Then she said in that same easy tone, "I have a cousin coming by later to grab a few things from my apartment, but I may not be back in time. Could you hold on to my spare keys for an hour or two and let her in if she gets here first?" There it was, and honestly I almost admired the escalation, because this wasn't milk or paper towels or a package, this was access. To her apartment, through me, it was the same system, just pushed to its logical end point. And the fact that she offered it so casually told me a lot. She either genuinely believed I might say yes, or she thought the social weirdness of refusing would pressure me into it. Maybe both. I looked at the keys then at her and said, "No, not harsh, not rude, just immediate." She held my gaze for a second, keys still in her hand. Then she said it would just be for a little while. I said no, same tone, same calm, and for the first time in all of this, she didn't smile right away. Her face didn't harden exactly, it just flattened. Like the social wrapping had dropped for half a second and what was underneath was simple irritation. Then she asked, "Is there a reason?" That question almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because of the audacity of it. As if I owed a reason for not wanting to be responsible for access to her apartment for a person I'd never met. As if refusal required justification, but the request itself didn't. So I said, "I'm not comfortable with that." She gave a tiny nod, then said, "You're very guarded." That line landed in a very familiar way, not openly insulting, not aggressive, just a quiet reframing. The problem isn't the request, the problem is your personality, your reluctance, your boundaries. I said probably, and I pulled my keys out. That seemed to throw her off more than if I had argued, because there was nothing to push against. No explanation to dismantle, no defensiveness to lean on, just acceptance. Yes, I'm guarded, and no, you still don't get access. She stood there for another second, then slipped the spare keys back into her bag and said, "Good to know." There it was again, the same phrase almost exactly from before. Not emotional, not wounded, just logged. Another result recorded. Another route closed. Then she turned, walked back toward her apartment, and that was it. No dramatic exit, no confrontation, just quiet recalibration. I unlocked my door and went inside, and I remember standing there in the entryway thinking, that was never about convenience. Not really. Because normal people don't escalate from borrowing household items to handing over apartment keys unless they have already built a whole private assumption of access in their head. And that's what this had been all along, not help. Not neighborliness, access, incremental, deniable, constantly tested access. Later that evening, I heard voices in the hallway and looked through the peephole out of pure reflex. Sandra was there with someone I assumed was the cousin. She had let them in herself, which meant, of course, that the situation had not actually required me at all. There had been another solution the entire time. There usually is. That was part of what made the whole thing so irritating in retrospect. The requests always arrived framed like the easiest or only reasonable option was my involvement, but most of the time it probably was. It was just the option that cost her the least, and that's not the same thing. Once I realized that, I felt this strange combination of annoyance and relief. Annoyance because it confirmed exactly what I had started to suspect. Relief because it meant I had finally stopped second-guessing myself. No, I wasn't being unneighborly. No, I wasn't making too much out of small things. I was just refusing to be turned into part of someone else's convenience infrastructure, and that's a very different thing. After that last interaction, things didn't escalate. They didn't need to, because by that point, everything that needed to be understood had already been understood. Sandra didn't stop existing as a neighbor. She didn't suddenly avoid me. She didn't become openly hostile. In fact, in a way, she became almost neutral, which coming from her felt very deliberate. We'd still pass each other in the hallway, still exchange the occasional hey, but that was it. No more quick questions, no more small requests, no more carefully framed favors. It was like I had moved out of a category in her mind, not neighbor, not friend, something else, unavailable, and that word felt surprisingly accurate. Not rude, not unfriendly, just not available. A few weeks passed and the building settled back into its normal rhythm, and something interesting happened. Once I stopped being part of her system, I started noticing how often she tried it with other people, not obsessively, just occasionally catching it. A short conversation in the hallway, a casual request in the lobby, that same tone, that same structure, that same smooth, low-pressure delivery that only felt low pressure until you realized how often it repeated. And every time I saw it, I felt that same quiet recognition. It only works if the other person doesn't fully see it yet. That's the key, not deception, not manipulation in some dramatic sense, just subtle persistence. A pattern that blends into normal behavior until you step back far enough to see it as a whole. A couple of times I saw people say yes, and I could almost map out what would probably happen next. The follow-up, the lack of return, the next request. The gradual shift, and I thought again about what Peter had said. She goes for the people who are polite. That line stuck with me more than anything else in this whole situation, because it wasn't really about Sandra, not entirely. It was about how easy it is for polite people to become quietly overextended, not because they want to be, but because each individual ask feels too small to push back against. And by the time you realize the pattern, you're already in it. That was the part that stayed with me, not the missing items, not even the awkward interactions, just that slow, almost invisible transition from helping out to being expected to help. That line is easy to miss, and once you cross it, it doesn't announce itself, it just becomes normal. A couple months later, I ran into Peter again and we talked for a bit. At one point, he nodded towards Sandra's door and said, "She's still doing her rounds." I said, "I think so." He laughed a little and said, "Yeah, new people in the building keep things interesting." That phrasing said everything. New people, fresh access points, same system, different participants, and I remember thinking how oddly sustainable that kind of behavior is, not because it's good, but because it never quite crosses the threshold where people feel justified making a big deal out of it. It lives in that gray zone, small enough to dismiss, repeated enough to matter, and that's where it thrives. Eventually, it just became background noise, something I was aware of but no longer involved in. And honestly, once I stepped out of it, I stopped feeling any real frustration about it, because at that point it wasn't happening to me anymore. It was just something that existed, a pattern in the environment, and that's where this story kind of settles. No big confrontation, no dramatic resolution. Just a quiet shift in how I responded to something that, first, didn't seem worth thinking about at all. If there's any takeaway from it, it's probably this: people don't always test boundaries in big, obvious ways. Sometimes they do it in small, repeatable, low-risk ways that only become visible over time. And the hardest part isn't recognizing it. It's deciding that something small is still worth saying no to, because that's where most people hesitate. That's where I hesitated. And that hesitation is exactly what makes systems like that work. Once you stop hesitating, it stops working. That's it. That's where this one ends. All right, that one is a very real kind of situation. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just someone quietly figuring out how much they can get away with, and other people slowly realizing they've been part of it. For the next story, we're going in a slightly darker direction again. This one starts with something that seems harmless, just a shared space, a routine, and a person who's always around at the same time. But over time, it turns into one of those situations where you start noticing patterns you can't explain, and the more you pay attention, the less normal it feels. Let's get into the next one. So this one started with a routine, a very simple one, the kind of thing you don't even think about until something interrupts it. Every morning before work, I'd go to the same cafe. Not because it was amazing, not because it was trendy, just because it was consistent. Same place, same time, same order. Coffee, something small to eat, maybe sit for a bit before heading out. It became automatic, to the point where I barely noticed the place itself anymore, just part of the day. And like most routines, it came with familiar faces, not people I knew, just regulars. The same few people showing up around the same time. There was an older guy who always sat by the window with a newspaper. A woman who came in, ordered something to go and left almost immediately. And then there was him. I never got his name. Never had a real conversation with him, but he was always there, same time as me, almost every day. At first, I didn't think anything of it. That's how routines work. You overlap with the same people. You start recognizing them. That's normal. He would sit at one of the tables near the back, not too close to the counter, not too far from the entrance. Just positioned, he'd usually have a laptop open. sometimes headphones, sometimes not, never really talking to anyone, just there, and if I'm being honest, I probably wouldn't even remember him now if it had stayed like that. But after a couple of weeks, I started noticing something small. Again, always something small. He was always already there when I arrived. At first, that didn't mean anything. Maybe he just got there earlier, that's normal. But then one day I showed up earlier than usual, like a lot earlier. I had an early meeting, so I stopped by around 7 instead of my usual 8, and there he was, same table, same setup, already there. I remember noticing it for maybe half a second, then moving on because again, not weird. Some people just get there early, but then it happened again. A few days later, I came in late. Way later than usual. Closer to 9:30, different crowd, different energy in the place, and still he was there, same table, same posture, same presence. That's when it registered, not strongly, just enough. Like a small note in the back of my mind, okay, that's a little consistent, but I still didn't think much of it. Until the next thing. One morning I walked in, ordered my coffee, and sat down like usual. And as I was sitting there, I realized something else. I couldn't remember a single time I had seen him leave. Not once. I had seen him there when I arrived, seen him still there when I left, but I had never seen him get up, pack his things, or walk out. Which again doesn't sound like much. People leave when you're not looking. Timing doesn't always line up. But when something repeats enough times, it starts to feel like more than coincidence. So the next day I paid attention, just casually, not staring, not being weird about it. Just noticing. I came in. He was there, same as always. I sat down, did my usual routine, finished my coffee. Waited a little longer than usual, just to see. He didn't move, didn't pack up, didn't shift, just stayed there, typing, occasionally looking up, then back to the screen. Eventually I had to leave, work, life, normal stuff, and as I walked out I glanced back once. He was still there. That was the first time it felt slightly off. Not creepy, not alarming, just off. Like a detail that doesn't fit perfectly into the rest of the picture, but you can't quite explain why yet. Over the next week I started noticing more. Small things, always small. He ordered the same thing every day. Black coffee, nothing else, no food, no variation. He rarely spoke to the staff, just a nod. A quick transaction, then back to his table. He didn't use his phone much, didn't take calls, didn't meet anyone, just sat there and worked, or at least looked like he was working. And the more I noticed him, the more I started realizing something else. He never seemed surprised by anything. Not by the crowd, not by the noise, not by people coming and going, like everything was exactly where he expected it to be. Which again isn't strange on its own, but combined with everything else it started to feel intentional, like he wasn't just part of the routine, he was fixed inside it, and once that thought showed up, I couldn't really ignore him anymore. At some point, it stopped being just me noticing him, and started feeling like he had noticed me too, not in an obvious way. He never stared, never waved, never tried to start a conversation. But there were these small, almost imperceptible moments where it felt like our awareness overlapped. The first time I really felt it was one morning when I walked in a little distracted. I had headphones in, wasn't really paying attention, just going through the motions, order, pay, sit down. And as I sat, I glanced up for a second, just a normal glance. And he was already looking in my direction, not directly at me, but close enough that it didn't feel like coincidence. And the moment our lines of sight almost crossed, he looked back down at his laptop, quickly, cleanly, like nothing had happened. I remember pausing for a second, just holding my cup, thinking, okay, that was probably nothing, because that's what your brain does. It smooths things out, gives people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just looking around. Maybe I just happened to look up at the same time. That kind of thing happens all the time, so I let it go, but then it happened again, and again, not every day, but often enough that it became noticeable. These tiny timing overlaps. Moments where I'd look up and he'd be just finishing looking in my direction. Or moments where I'd shift in my seat and a second later he'd adjust slightly too, never synchronized exactly, just slightly offset, and that offset made it feel more real. Less like coincidence, more like reaction. That's when I started becoming more aware of my own movements, not consciously at first, just small things, like noticing when I reached for my cup, or when I checked my phone, or when I leaned back in my chair, and then sometimes seeing him shift shortly after. Again, not always, not enough to prove anything, but enough to make the pattern feel possible, and that's the worst kind of pattern. The one you can't quite confirm, but also can't fully dismiss. A few days later, something happened that made it harder to ignore. I was sitting there halfway through my coffee when I realized I had forgotten something important at home. So I packed up earlier than usual, not my normal routine. I stood up, grabbed my things, and started heading toward the door. And for some reason, right before I left, I glanced back. He was watching me, not subtly, not looking away, just watching. And the moment I noticed it, he closed his laptop, slowly, deliberately, and stood up at the exact same time. That was the first moment it felt wrong, not confusing, not ambiguous, just wrong. Because until then, everything had lived in that grey area, coincidence, timing, patterns you might be imagining, but this was direct. I walked out of the cafe, didn't stop, didn't slow down, just kept going. And about 10 seconds later, I heard the door open behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. I told myself not to because I didn't want to overreact, but I could feel it. That presence, not close, not following right behind me, just there in the same direction. After a few steps, I glanced to the side just enough to catch a reflection in a window. He was outside, walking, same direction. That didn't mean anything, not necessarily. It's a public street. People leave places at the same time, go the same way. That happens all the time. But my brain had already connected too many small dots. So instead of continuing straight like I normally would, I turned, not sharply, just a normal turn down a side street, something I wouldn't usually do, and I waited a couple seconds before checking again through another reflection. And he didn't turn, he kept going straight, which should have reassured me, and maybe it did, a little, but not enough, because now there was a new variable. He could move, he did leave. Just very specific times. And somehow those times seemed to align with me more often than they should have. That's when I started thinking something I didn't want to think. Not that he was following me, that would have been too obvious, too easy to confirm, but something more subtle. Something like, he's aware of me in the same way I'm becoming aware of him, and I didn't like that, not at all. After that morning, I decided I needed to test it, not because I was convinced something bad was happening, but because uncertainty has a way of making normal things feel distorted. And at that point, I couldn't tell whether I was noticing a real pattern or just feeding one, so I changed my routine. Slightly. The first test was simple. I came in, ordered like usual, sat down like usual, and then after maybe 3 minutes I stood back up and moved to a different table. Not dramatically, just casually, the kind of thing anyone might do if they wanted a different seat. He didn't look up right away, at least not that I saw, but about a minute later he adjusted too, not changing tables, just shifting his laptop and chair angle slightly, enough that his line of sight now opened more naturally toward where I was sitting. That could still mean nothing. Cafes are shared spaces. People reposition all the time, so I didn't react. I just sat there and told myself not to get carried away. The next day I tried something else. Instead of sitting in my usual spot, I stayed standing for longer than normal after getting my coffee. I added sugar I didn't want, checked my phone, looked at the pastry case, just lingered, and when I finally turned to sit down I caught him watching the counter area, not staring, not frozen, just waiting, as if the unresolved part of the morning was where I'd end up. And the second I sat down he went back to typing. That one bothered me more than it should have. Because again, nothing dramatic happened, nothing anyone else in the room would have noticed, but that was exactly the problem. Everything stayed small enough to be deniable, small enough that even I kept trying to explain it away in real time. A few days later I made a bigger change. I didn't go in the morning at all. I skipped the cafe completely, worked from home. Told myself I'd just reset the whole thing by breaking the pattern for a day, and honestly, that helped a little. By the afternoon, I felt kind of ridiculous for letting it take up so much space in my head. Maybe I had just become hyper-aware. Maybe this was just what happens when two people overlap often enough in the same environment. So the next morning I went back, earlier than usual, a lot earlier, and there he was, same table, already there. That alone shouldn't have mattered. But after skipping a day, seeing him there again felt different, sharper. Like the whole pattern had resumed exactly where I left it. This time I didn't sit right away. I ordered my coffee and stayed near the counter, pretending to check messages. Then I looked toward the back of the cafe. He wasn't looking at me, but his laptop screen had gone dark, like he hadn't touched it in a while. That detail stuck with me, because he always looked like he was working, always typing or reading or focused on the screen. But in that moment, he looked more like someone waiting inside the shape of work than actually doing it. And once that thought entered my head, I couldn't shake it. I sat down eventually, different table again, closer to the window this time, and maybe 10 minutes later, one of the baristas came by with a cloth to wipe the table next to me. Completely normal, routine cafe stuff. But while she was there, she smiled at me and said, "You switched spots today." Just a friendly little comment. I smiled back and said, "Yeah, felt like a change." And before I could stop myself, I glanced toward the back. He had looked up, not at the barista, at me only for a second, then back down. That shouldn't have felt meaningful. But it did, because it added to this growing sense that any variation in my routine registered with him immediately. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just as information. That was the part making me uncomfortable. It didn't feel like interest in a normal human way. It felt like tracking. Low-level, passive, consistent tracking. Then I tried the most obvious test so far. I packed up to leave much earlier than usual, on purpose. But instead of going straight to the door, I stopped at the bathroom first, stayed there for maybe 2 minutes, washed my hands slowly, counted in my head, then I came back out. His laptop was closed. He was putting on his jacket, not rushing, not hovering, just already in the process of leaving. And I felt this cold little drop in my stomach, because maybe he had already planned to leave. Maybe his timing just happened to line up, but after everything else it didn't feel random anymore. I left the cafe, walked half a block, then stopped suddenly and pretended to retie my shoe. When I looked up in the reflection of a parked car, I saw him exit the cafe about 10 seconds later. Again, not close enough to be obvious. Not far enough to feel unrelated, and that was the moment I stopped telling myself this was probably nothing. Not because I had proof of some huge sinister thing, I didn't, but because the repetition had crossed a threshold in my head, too many little alignments, too many reactive shifts, too many ways in which my movement seemed to quietly structure his. I stood up, changed direction completely, and crossed the street. He kept walking straight, again. Which should have been the reassuring ending, and on some level it was, but it also made the whole thing stranger. Because if he wasn't following me, then what exactly was he doing? That question got under my skin more than the idea of being followed ever did, because following is simple. You can identify it, name it, react to it. This felt murkier, like he wasn't trying to get somewhere with me. He was just orienting himself around me more than he should have been. And I didn't know what to do with that. Up until that point, everything had still technically lived inside my own perception. That was the hardest part of it. Because when something is only happening in the space between your observations and your interpretation, it's very easy to keep doubting yourself. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I'm hyper-aware now. Maybe I've accidentally built a pattern out of coincidence. That kind of thing. And honestly, I probably would have kept doing that a lot longer if not for what happened a few days later. It was a Thursday morning, nothing unusual about it. Same cafe, same routine, same low-level tension sitting in the back of my mind the moment I walked in and saw him already there. I ordered, sat down, tried not to pay too much attention. About 10 minutes later, one of the baristas came over to my table with the wrong drink. Not mine, a black coffee. I said, "Oh, I didn't order this." She looked confused for a second, then glanced toward the back of the cafe, then back at me. Then she said, "Sorry, I thought it was for you." That threw me a little because I never order black coffee there, not once, so I just smiled politely and said, "No worries." She took the cup away. But maybe 30 seconds later, she came back again, this time just to wipe the edge of the table near me, and said in a more casual tone, "You two usually come in together, right?" I looked up at her for a second. I genuinely didn't understand what she meant. So I said, "What?" and she nodded vaguely toward the back where he was sitting. "The guy with the laptop, I thought you were together." That moment felt very strange, not dramatic, just very, very clear, because it meant the overlap between us wasn't just something I had started imagining. It was visible enough from the outside that someone who worked there had grouped us together in her mind. I tried to keep my reaction neutral and said, "No, I don't know him." She blinked, looked mildly surprised, and said, "Oh, sorry, you both just always come in around the same time." Then she laughed lightly and added, "Guess I made up a whole little story." I smiled, said it was fine, and she walked away. But I sat there for the next few minutes feeling this weird shift in my chest, because on one hand, what she said gave me a kind of explanation. Of course the staff would start associating us. We were both there constantly. Same time, same place, same rhythm. That was normal. But on the other hand, it also confirmed just how fixed the overlap had become. Fixed enough that from the outside it looked intentional, like a shared routine. And the reality was I had never agreed to any shared routine. That distinction really got to me. A little while later, I got up to throw something away, and when I came back, he was looking at the pastry case instead of his laptop. Again, that shouldn't have mattered. But suddenly, after what the barista said, everything felt more sharply outlined. Not because it proved anything sinister, but because it made the situation more socially real. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The pattern existed enough for other people to notice its shape. That afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I did something I probably should have done earlier. I told a friend, not in an alarmed way, just laid it out as simply as I could. The same guy is always there. He seems to adjust when I adjust. He leaves around when I leave. The barista thought we came in together. My friend listened, then immediately asked, "Have you ever talked to him?" And weirdly, that question made me pause more than anything else, because the answer was no, not once, not even a hello. And that itself started to feel strange. If two people overlap that consistently in a small, familiar place, most of the time eventually there's some acknowledgement. A nod, a hey, a little recognition, but there had been none, just this silent mutual awareness. My friend said maybe I should just break the tension and say hi sometime. And yeah, from the outside, that probably sounded reasonable, maybe even obvious, but the idea of doing that made something in me pull back immediately. Because I didn't actually want connection, I wanted clarity, and I had a strong feeling that talking to him wouldn't give me that. It would just turn the whole thing into something more concrete before I understood what it already was. Still, that conversation with my friend did make me realize something. If I kept going to the cafe exactly the same way, the pattern would keep reinforcing itself, whether it meant anything or not. So the next morning, I changed things again. This time I didn't sit down at all. I got my coffee to go, deliberately, and as I was waiting near the counter, I looked toward the back. He had looked up, not dramatically, just enough to register the change. Then he reached for his cup almost immediately, like some internal adjustment had been triggered. I took my coffee and left, didn't linger, didn't look back, and for the first time in a while, I felt a small amount of relief, because leaving disrupted the shape of the morning. It broke the usual rhythm, but that relief didn't last long, because later that same day, something happened that made the entire situation feel a step closer than before. I was out during lunch, walking past a pharmacy a few blocks from my office when I saw him inside through the window, not at a distance, not vaguely similar. Him, same jacket, same posture, same laptop bag. He was standing near the front, waiting in line. Now, logically, that shouldn't have meant anything. People exist in the same neighborhood. People use nearby businesses. That's normal. But the moment I saw him there outside the controlled routine of the cafe, I felt that strange tightening again. Because until then, he had belonged to one place in my mind. The cafe, the fixed table, the repetitive overlap. Seeing him elsewhere made him feel suddenly less like part of a setting, and more like a person whose orbit might overlap mine in ways I hadn't accounted for. He didn't see me. At least I don't think he did. I kept walking, didn't stop. But the rest of the day I couldn't stop thinking about one annoying possibility. Maybe the pattern wasn't as confined as I wanted to believe. And once that thought showed up, everything felt a little less easy to contain. After seeing him outside the cafe, something changed. Not in what was happening, but in how I experienced it. Before, everything had been contained. One place, one routine, one overlapping pattern. Now that I had seen him somewhere else, that boundary felt thinner, less defined. And because of that, going back to the cafe the next morning felt different, more deliberate. Like I was choosing to step back into something I didn't fully understand. I almost didn't go, considered skipping it entirely. But at the same time, I didn't want to let something this vague completely dictate my routine. So I went, earlier than usual again, and yeah, he was already there. Same table, same setup. No visible change, which somehow made it worse. Because it meant the pattern was still intact. Completely unaffected by everything that had happened in my head, I ordered my coffee. Sat down, told myself to just treat it like a normal morning. For the first few minutes, nothing felt different, just the usual background noise of the cafe, people coming in, coffee machines, low conversation. Then at some point I felt it, that subtle awareness again, not a sound, not a movement. Just that internal signal that you're being looked at. I didn't react immediately. I gave it a few seconds, then I looked up. And this time he didn't look away, not right away, not instantly like before. He held the look, not intensely, not aggressively, just long enough to make it clear it wasn't accidental. Maybe 2 seconds, 3 at most. Then he looked back down at his laptop, and something about that small delay made my chest tighten. Because until then, every overlap had been avoidable, deniable. This was a choice, a very small one, but still a choice. I looked back down at my coffee, trying to keep my reaction neutral, trying not to escalate it in my own head, but it was already there, that shift, that sense that something had moved from passive observation into awareness, and awareness changes everything. A few minutes later, I noticed something else. His laptop was closed, again, just like the other day. But this time, instead of packing up, he just sat there, hands resting on the table, looking at nothing in particular, or at least pretending to. That felt strange, because the laptop had always been part of the scene, part of the explanation. He was working, he was focused, that's why he was there. But now, without it open, that explanation felt thinner, less convincing. I finished my coffee faster than usual, not rushing, just not lingering. And as I stood up to leave, I had that same instinct as before. Don't look back, just go. But halfway to the door I did anyway, and he was already standing, not behind me, not close, just up, jacket on, bag in hand, like the decision to leave had been made at the same moment. That was the closest it had come to being unmistakable, still not proof of anything, but no longer comfortable to dismiss either. I walked out. This time I didn't slow down, didn't stop. Didn't check reflections, just kept moving, turned a corner, kept going, and for a few minutes nothing happened, no footsteps behind me, no sense of proximity, just normal street noise, which should have settled it. And maybe it did partially, but the tension didn't fully go away, because the pattern inside the cafe had already crossed a line. It didn't need to extend beyond that to feel real. Later that day I made a decision. I wasn't going back there tomorrow, not as a reaction, not out of fear, just to break the loop completely, to see what happened when I removed myself from the pattern altogether. And honestly, I expected that to be the end of it. Just a strange overlap with a stranger that would fade once the shared routine disappeared. But the next part of this is what made the whole thing stick with me, because the pattern didn't just disappear, it adjusted. The next morning I didn't go to the cafe. I made coffee at home, left for work a little earlier than usual, and took a slightly different route just to make the whole day feel less patterned. And honestly, for the first hour or two, I felt better. Little stupid maybe, for how much space the whole thing had taken up in my head. Because once I stepped outside the routine, everything immediately started looking more ordinary again. That's the weird thing about patterns. They feel huge when you're inside them. Then the moment you break one, part of your brain goes, see, nothing. You built this up, so I tried to let it go. Then on my lunch break, I walked to a small sandwich place I go to sometimes. Not often enough to call it a routine. Just once every couple of weeks, maybe. I ordered, stepped to the side, waited for my number. And while I was standing there, I saw someone come in through the glass reflection on the drink fridge. Same jacket, same laptop bag, same slightly controlled way of moving. I turned and yeah, it was him. For a second, my brain almost rejected it, not because it was impossible, because technically it was. This place was still within the same general area. Office neighborhood, lunch hour, people overlapping in the same few spots, all of that was perfectly normal. But it didn't feel normal. Not after the cafe, not after the timing. He didn't look at me, at least not directly. He just walked in, got in line, and stood there like anyone else. I grabbed my food as soon as it was ready and left. Didn't stay, didn't sit, didn't test anything. I just left. And the whole walk back to work, I kept doing that exhausting internal argument with myself. You're overreacting. No, this is weird. No, this is a neighborhood. Yes, but why him again? Because that happens sometimes, not like this. That back and forth is what wore me down more than anything. Not fear, not panic. Just the constant low-level effort of trying to determine whether I was seeing a pattern or forcing one. The next day, I skipped the cafe again. Not on purpose this time, exactly. I just didn't want to deal with the mental math of it. After work, I stopped at a grocery store near my apartment, different area from my office, different part of the day, different context. I was in the produce section, half paying attention when I got that same feeling again, that small internal shift, that awareness. I looked up, and I saw him at the end of the aisle, not close, not hovering, just there, holding one of those little hand baskets, looking at the shelves. He didn't react when I looked over, didn't seem startled, didn't move away, and maybe that's what got to me. Because if this had all been coincidence, I almost wanted him to seem surprised. Humanly surprised. Like, oh, weird you again, but there was none of that. Just the same calm, fixed presence as always. Like overlap itself didn't require acknowledgement. I turned my cart immediately and went to a different aisle. Stood there for maybe 15 seconds pretending to look at something I didn't need. Then I left the cart there and walked toward the front of the store. Not running, not rushing, just very clearly done shopping. I waited near the self-checkout area long enough to see whether he would appear. He didn't, so after a minute I left. And standing outside with absolutely nothing purchased, I finally admitted something to myself that I'd been trying not to say plainly. Even if none of this was intentional, it was affecting me like it was. And that mattered, because whether someone is deliberately making you uncomfortable or just repeatedly colliding with your life in a way that feels invasive, the effect on your nervous system can end up being weirdly similar. That evening, I told the same friend from before that I'd seen him again. Different places now, different times. Same guy. My friend got a lot less casual about it at that point. Not alarmist, just more serious. They said, okay, even if there's an innocent explanation, you need to stop giving this person repeated access to your routine. That phrasing helped, because it took the question away from what is he doing and moved it to what can I control. That was easier, cleaner, so I changed more things. I stopped going to the cafe entirely, for a while anyway. Changed the grocery store I used after work. Started taking a different street to the office. Not dramatically. Just enough to stop feeling like a fixed point on a map, and for a few days nothing happened. No sightings, no weird overlap, no sense of that same presence showing up at the edges of ordinary places, which should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me feel tense in a different way, because now I was waiting for absence to mean something. Waiting to see whether the pattern had really broken, or whether it had only paused because I had become less predictable. That's when I realized how much this had already gotten under my skin. A normal stranger shouldn't be able to do that just by existing in a few of the same places. But this didn't feel like a normal stranger anymore. Not to me. Then, on the 5th day of not seeing him anywhere, I got off work late and stopped at a convenience store a few blocks from the station. Tiny place, bright lights, almost empty. I grabbed a bottle of water, walked up to the register, and as I was paying, the front door opened. I looked over without thinking, and there he was, again. This time the reaction in my body was immediate. Not dramatic, but immediate. That cold drop in the stomach, the sudden sharpening of everything around you. He saw me too, I know he did. Because this time there was no angle, no reflection, no maybe. And for half a second, neither of us looked away. Then he stepped aside to let another customer pass in front of him, and turned toward one of the shelves near the door. As if that tiny pause between us had never happened. I took my receipt and left so quickly I almost forgot the water. By the time I got outside, my hands were shaking a little. Not because I thought something was about to happen right there, but because the coincidence had finally become too repetitive for my brain to settle around. 1 place is nothing. 2 places, maybe. 3, uncomfortable. But by then it had become this chain of reappearances that kept surviving every explanation I tried to give it. And I remember standing on the sidewalk that night thinking, I don't actually care anymore whether there's a perfect explanation. I just want it to stop. A quick pause here. This is the point in the story where it stops being, maybe I'm imagining it, and becomes, okay, even if there is some innocent version of this, it's crossed into something I can't just absorb and ignore. Anyway, let's keep going. The next morning I didn't leave for work at my usual time. I stayed home for an extra hour, made coffee, sat in silence, and tried to think clearly about what to do next. Because at that point, I had reached the limit of quietly adapting around it. I didn't want to keep changing stores and streets and routines forever just because one person had become a recurring source of tension I couldn't explain. So I decided I needed to do something simple. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just something that would force reality to clarify itself a little. If I saw him again, I was going to acknowledge him, not accuse him, not ask some huge loaded question, just acknowledge him. Because the strangest part of all of this was still the complete absence of normal human recognition between us. If the overlap was innocent, maybe the silence was what made it feel distorted. Maybe breaking that would make the whole thing collapse back into normality. That was the theory anyway. I went to work, kept the day as ordinary as I could. No cafe, no detours, no special precautions beyond being more aware than I wanted to be. Nothing happened during the day. Then on the way home, I stopped at a small pharmacy near the station. Not the same one as before, different one. I went in for toothpaste and a couple of basic things. And while I was standing near the checkout line, I saw him in the convex security mirror near the ceiling. Behind me, all over, not close. Just there, that was it, that was the moment. I turned around fully, looked straight at him and said, "Hey." Not loud, not shaky, just a normal human hey. For the first time in this entire story, he reacted in a way that felt openly real. He froze for maybe half a second, then looked at me directly, and said, "Hey." That was it. One word, completely normal tone. No awkwardness. No surprise beyond that initial pause, no visible guilt, nothing. I said, "I see you around a lot." I tried to keep it light, almost casual, something you could say to a regular at a cafe without implying anything heavier. He held my gaze for a second, then nodded once and said, "Yeah, same." That answer was so flat, so clean, that it gave me almost nothing to work with. So I added, "You used to go to that cafe in the mornings too, right?" He said, "Sometimes, sometimes." That word irritated me immediately, not because it was false necessarily, but because it was so evasively small compared to reality. I said, "Right." And then there was this pause, not long, but long enough that it became obvious we had reached the edge of the interaction. He wasn't going to elaborate. Wasn't going to smile and say something normal like, "Funny running into you everywhere," or "Yeah, I work nearby," or anything else that would put the overlap back into ordinary social language. He just stood there, present, calm, closed, so I nodded once, grabbed my stuff and went to the register. Didn't look back again until I was outside. He came out maybe a minute later, turned in the opposite direction and walked away. And for some reason, that almost made it worse. Because the interaction hadn't relieved anything, it hadn't clarified anything. If anything, it had confirmed the strangest part. He was fully aware of the repeated overlap and had no interest in explaining it, contextualizing it, or smoothing it into something humanly normal. He was content to let it remain what it was, and what it was, at least from where I was standing, was unsettling. That night, I couldn't stop replaying his face when I said, "Hey," not because he looked guilty. Not because he looked threatening. He didn't. What bothered me was how little there was there, how blankly acceptable the entire thing seemed to him. As if recurring in someone else's environment over and over again without ever acknowledging it was not unusual enough to require comment. That's a very hard thing to settle around, because people usually give you something. A tone, a smile, a bit of awkwardness, a context clue, some signal that they understand the social reality of the moment. He gave me almost none of that, just "Yeah, same." And that left me with the same question as before, only sharper now. Was he simply a very strange person with routines that overlapped mine in an unusually persistent way, or was there something more intentional in how those overlaps kept happening? I still couldn't answer that, but after that I stopped caring quite as much about the answer, because the feeling had already done its work. I didn't need a legal proof level of certainty to know I didn't want this person recurring in my life anymore, so I made one final adjustment, a bigger one this time, and that's basically what ended it. So the way it ended wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no final reveal. No moment where everything suddenly made sense. I just stopped going to that part of the city as much, stopped using the same small set of places. Shifted my routine enough that I was no longer predictable in the way I had been. And after that I didn't see him again. Not at the cafe, not at lunch, not in stores. Now that doesn't prove anything. It doesn't confirm some hidden intention. It doesn't explain the overlap. It doesn't give the story a clean answer. But it did confirm one thing for me. The pattern needed my consistency to exist. Once I removed that, it disappeared. And that's the part that stuck with me, not fear. Not danger, just that quiet realization that sometimes you don't need to fully understand something to know it doesn't belong in your space. And stepping out of it is enough. That's where that one ends. All right, that one is more about feeling than explanation. No clear villain, no clear answer, just that slow buildup of this is too consistent to ignore. Now this next story is different. This one does have a clearer turning point. It starts simple, just a shared apartment situation, two people who don't really know each other that well. At first, everything is fine, then one small thing doesn't line up, then another, and eventually you realize you don't actually know who you've been living with. Let's get into it. So this happened when I was renting a place with someone I didn't know that well, not a close friend, not even really an acquaintance before moving in. Just one of those situations where you find a decent apartment, split the cost, and hope the other person is normal enough. His name was Daniel, early 30s, worked remotely, quiet, polite, the kind of roommate you don't think twice about at first. Which honestly is exactly what you want. No drama, no chaos, just someone who exists in the same space without making things complicated. For the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. We had opposite schedules most of the time. I'd leave for work in the morning, he'd already be awake. Come back in the evening, sometimes he'd be in his room, sometimes not. We'd exchange a few words in the kitchen, basic stuff. How was your day? Pretty normal. Cool. Nothing weird, nothing memorable, and that's important. Because when things eventually did start feeling off, it wasn't because of something obvious. It was because of something small, something that didn't line up. The first thing I noticed was the fridge, specifically how things moved inside it, not disappeared, not stolen, just shifted. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. I put something on one shelf, come back later, and it would be on another. Nothing missing, nothing opened, just not where I left it. And normally I wouldn't care. It's a shared fridge. People move things around, that's completely normal. But after a few days, I started noticing something else. The changes were too consistent, not random rearranging, not messy, if anything, more organized. Like someone was realigning things into a neater structure every time I wasn't around. Which again isn't a problem. Some people are just like that, so I didn't say anything. But then it spread beyond the fridge. I'd leave a mug on the counter. Come back, it would be in the drying rack. Clean, I'd leave a book on the table. Come back, it would be stacked neatly with others. I'd leave my keys slightly off center. Next time I saw them, they were placed perfectly aligned with the edge. At that point, I assumed one thing: Daniel was just very organized, which honestly is not a bad trait in a roommate. If anything, it's a plus, so I let it go, until the first thing happened that wasn't neutral. One night, I came home later than usual. Around midnight, the apartment was quiet, lights off except for a dim one in the kitchen. I walked in, dropped my bag, and immediately noticed something. The door to my room was slightly open. Now I always close my door, not locked. Just closed, it's a habit, and the way it was open wasn't wide, just a few inches, enough to be noticeable, but also easy to dismiss. Maybe I didn't close it fully, maybe it just didn't latch, maybe air pressure, all normal explanations. So I walked in, everything looked fine, nothing missing, nothing obviously touched, but the feeling was off, subtle, like walking into a room that's technically the same, but something in it has been adjusted slightly. I checked my desk, my bed, my shelves. Everything looked normal, so I told myself I was overthinking it, closed the door, went to sleep. The next day I asked Daniel casually, "Hey, did you go into my room at all yesterday?" Not accusing, just checking. He shook his head immediately. No hesitation, no confusion, just a clean answer, which should have settled it, and maybe it did for a little while, until it happened again, a few days later. Same thing, door slightly open, everything inside looking normal. Too normal, that's the part that started bothering me. Not messy, not disturbed, just arranged. That's when I started paying attention more closely. And the next time I left the apartment, I did something small. I placed a pen on my desk at a very specific angle, not something you'd notice unless you were looking for it, just slightly off. Then I left, went to work, came back, door closed this time, which was already different. I walked in, looked at the desk. The pen was straight, perfectly aligned with the edge, and I remember just standing there for a second, because now it wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about shared space, it wasn't even about organization. Someone had been in my room, and they had adjusted something so small it was almost invisible, but not invisible enough. That night I didn't say anything, not immediately. I just sat in my room and thought about it, because the situation was strange. If Daniel was going into my room, why? Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged, nothing obvious had changed, just these tiny adjustments, which made it feel less like theft and more like something else, something harder to define. The next day I tried something else. I left a book slightly open on my desk, not closed, not flat, just in between, something unnatural enough that it wouldn't accidentally fix itself. Then I left, came back, door closed, book closed, perfectly. That's when the feeling shifted from uncertainty to certainty. Uncertainty is worse in situations like this, because now you have to decide what to do with it. I confronted him that evening, not aggressively, just directly. "Hey, I need to ask you something again. Are you going into my room when I'm not here?" He paused this time, just slightly, then said, "No, why would I do that?" That pause, it was small, but it was there. And once you notice something like that, you can't unnotice it, I said, because things keep moving in there. He shook his head again. "I haven't touched your stuff." Same tone, same calm, but now it didn't land the same way, because I knew what I had seen. And that's when the situation became something much more uncomfortable than just weird roommate. Because now it wasn't just about the behavior, it was about the denial, clean, consistent, unbreakable denial. And living with someone like that changes the entire feeling of a space. Because now every time you leave, there's a question: what happens here when I'm not here? I ended up setting up a very simple solution. Nothing extreme, just a small camera in my room, not hidden in some elaborate way, just placed where it could see the door and the desk. The next day I left like usual, went to work, tried not to think about it. But of course I did, all day. When I got home, I didn't go into my room right away. I just sat down, opened the app, and checked the footage. And there it was, around mid-afternoon. The door opened. Daniel stepped in, calm, casual, like it was normal. He didn't rush, didn't sneak, just walked in, looked around, went to the desk and adjusted the book. Closed it, aligned it, then he looked at the shelf, adjusted something else slightly, then left. That was it, no searching, no stealing, no hesitation, just correction, like he was maintaining something, and honestly, that was somehow worse, because it meant there wasn't a clear goal, no obvious reason, just a behavior, a need to adjust things that weren't his. I moved out 2 weeks later. Didn't make a big scene, didn't argue, just said the arrangement wasn't working. and left. We never had a final confrontation about it, because I realized something important. I didn't actually need an explanation. Some behaviors don't become less unsettling just because you understand them. And living with someone who enters your space, changes small things, and then denies it calmly, is one of those situations. Even if there's some harmless explanation behind it, the feeling it creates is enough. And that was enough for me. That's where this one ends.